Hello, all you lovely people. Look at all the comments already. How exciting. I'm happy to see everybody. Good evening, Ritz. Where are you? It's still afternoon over here where I am. Boss lady, glad you could make it. Sorry to hear that your co-worker is continuing to be an ass. Yeah, boss lady wasn't feeling great yesterday, so she begged off, which is absolutely fair. I'm a little under the weather myself still with the just wrecking my stomach, but I have had a little nap and I am ready to carry on. I fear that these arguments from the to be as entertaining as was the hi Mary. Your penny pill, yes, BGPO. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I'm afraid they're not going to be as entertaining as the prosecution because he was just so very good and she is just so very guilty. But and I suspect that they're hi Cabby that they're not even going to be as entertaining as the like the Corey Richards defense because at least they were obnoxious and off-putting and everything the whole time. These guys are just a little bit lackluster. Same word I used to describe the judge. I didn't find them very inspiring either of being impressed or of being annoyed. But the prosecutor, yeah, he was fantastic. He was truly fantastic. And the arguments are my favorite part. I mean, I could argue for Canada, and I love to argue. So, in the way of debating type thing, right? And and like watching somebody like this get argued into prison is my favorite. Hi, Billie Jean. Cappy says, I get the feeling that the prosecutor here had been waiting a long time to get at Nancy, even without COVID delays. Yeah, he certainly seemed Penny movie. Oh, I saw that with Little Whiskers. Thank you. I'll have to look it up. It's probably a Netflix thing, I guess. Eh? The Little Whiskers is telling me about the movie. There's a movie, How to Murder Your Husband, the Nancy Brophy story. Yeah. Me too, right? I like a good argument, and I also like to, I'm not gonna lie, I like to win. And I'm often very but I also don't speak out of turn generally, right? I don't say something if I'm not sure of what I'm saying. So, yeah, you want to see it, boss lady. It's very good. It's just very good. It's always so. Oh, you're back to your old picture again. It's always so rewarding to me to watch these people get handed their butts by a good closing argument. Yeah, and all at the height of the pandemic. Yeah, that's her. Sybil Shepherd plays Nancy. Yeah, that's what you were saying. I will definitely have to look it up. I don't have a Netflix subscription because I can't remember. I'm boycotting them for some reason, some stupid, horrible thing that they did. I mean, they're all doing stupid, horrible things these days, and you can't boycott everybody. But sometimes I pay for a month so that I can get something that I really want to see or whatever. So I wish we could just watch stuff on here together and hang out and watch, the Nancy Brophy movie or something, but I guess we wouldn't really get away with that. Hi, Batty McBadface. Nice to see you. Oh, Jem in the Mud is here. Hi, Jem. How are you? Yes, the prosecutor was epic. So, yes, I like to start off with mugshot because it's such an attractive shot. But yeah, I guess we'll just get started with the sorry. There we go. We'll just get started with this. So it's just set up for the defense to start their argument, and they go for quite a bit. Yeah, they go for quite a bit. It's a couple hours. So here we go.
And Ms. Weinmiller, when you're ready. Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today.
Great.
Thank you for being here, Dave.
I forgot to mention, I'm sorry, boss lady. I didn't realize it was today that was your birthday. So happy birthday today. I thought you had been talking about yesterday. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned it anyways. But happy birthday to you. I'm sure you don't live in a zoo.
Day after day after day and week after week, we do understand what kind of commitment you've made to be here, and we appreciate that from each and every one of you.
It's on YouTube. Ooh.
The American system of justice is unlike no other. In this country, we do not convict the accused person on suspicion, on conjecture, or on guesswork. In American courts, we insist that the prosecution prove the person's guilt beyond all reasonable doubt and with decent, reliable evidence. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean maybe she is guilty. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean probably she is guilty. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not even mean almost certainly she is guilty. To convict a person in this country, you must be certain. If there is any reasonable possibility that Nancy Crampton Brophy is not guilty, you must give her the benefit of the doubt and return a verdict of not guilty. Let me say that again, because it's very, very important. If there's any reasonable possibility Nancy Brophy is not guilty, you must give her the benefit of the doubt, and you are required under our system of laws to return a verdict of not guilty. For perspective, let's talk about how the rest of this courthouse works, how other proceedings work, the level of proofs that we use in American courts. Probable cause is the lowest of the standards that we apply in this system. It means there's a good chance it's true. It is enough evidence for the police to kick in your door, to search through your bedroom. It's not nothing, but that's the very lowest standard that we apply in our courts. A preponderance of the evidence means that it's more likely than not that it's true. More likely than not that it's true. That's the second of the 4 stages of proof. That's what's needed to convict a person, for instance, of running a red light. The second to highest is called clear and convincing. And clear and convincing is defined as evidence which does not leave the issue seriously in doubt. That's the second highest stage of evidence, proof. That stage, or that level of proof, is what's required for the government to take your children away from you. But even that is not the highest level of proof, and not the level of proof that you're required to apply here today. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that's the very highest standard of proof, and it requires the elimination of every reasonable doubt.
It is already boring, but I do like her outfit. She looks, she's not offending me with her outfit. Looks like a nice linen suit she's got on there.
If there's any reasonable possibility that Nancy Crampton Brophy is not guilty, you must give her the benefit of that doubt. You must return a verdict of not guilty. The prosecution must prove a person's guilt beyond all reasonable doubt, and it must prove that with decent, reliable evidence. And in this case, the state has failed in that. The love that Nancy and Dan Brophy had for each other was no mere possibility. It was the best proven fact in this trial. You've heard about possibilities throughout this trial. Many, many, many possibilities. You heard today many, many, many possibilities, a theory. But the love story of Nancy and Dan Brophy.
Okay, so I just have to say, I mean, I feel like there was plenty of proof that Dan loved Nancy. If you look at the whole thing of, love is a verb. It's an action word. And he was always doing things for her. I don't recall any evidence of Nancy loving Dan. All we have is her word, her saying that she loved Dan. But we have plenty of evidence of Dan's actions that proved that he loved her.
Was woven throughout the entire trial. It was told from a different angle by each witness who was lucky enough to have known them both. It was even told by the witnesses who knew one much better than the other. And it didn't matter which party called the person to testify. Every single witness who knew them told you their piece, their observations of that love story. This love that Nancy and Dan had for each other, it was no mere possibility. It was the best proven fact in this trial. On the last morning they had off together, that they were free, Dan and Nancy Brophy went out for breakfast at the Six Corners Cafe. After breakfast, they went to a rummage sale. Of course, that was Dan's choice. They picked up a few items, including a toy chest for Nathaniel's daughter. Nancy spent the rest of the morning sanding it, applying a coat of primer, thought about how to puzzle through this hole in the story that she was working on. Dan puttered on his projects, and they headed off to Avamere for a shift that evening. And you can see that in the bank records, that that's what they did on the morning of June 1st. They slept in their bedroom, as they always did, but Nancy was up most of the night, reworking this trilogy that she was readying for publication. Dan went to sleep long before she finally crashed, and in the morning, she awoke to him wondering about the wet towels that were piled up in the sink. It appeared he'd already been up, feeding the chickens, walking the dog, his well-established morning routine. That began at 4 a.m., a time that Nancy then considered far too...
Right? More actions that Dan takes to show his love to the animals, to his students, to his community, to everybody, right? He gets up bright and early to see to all the things that he loves and cares about and is devoted to, while Nancy sleeps in and waits for him to go bring her coffee.
Too early to start the day. Dan had to address the leak before he left for live fire at OCI, so Nancy imagined she went out to pick up a Starbucks for herself at the drive-thru. She remembers the conversation about the leak. She remembers pulling on tights. She remembers them both readying for their respective days. And that was the last time she saw her husband. That was the last time she saw the man she loved. There are promises, and then there are promises. Dan and Nancy made a promise to share their lives, a promise that they reaffirmed just a couple of years before he died, and they kept that promise to each other. On June 2nd, 2018, they were looking forward to a gradual wind down that almost certainly would have them moving further out of town and into a smaller place with good land, a place they both hoped would be near but not in the foothills of the coastal range. A dream that Dan Brophy's mother agreed would make him happy. They were looking for maybe a smaller plot of land outside of Portland where he could have a big garden and all the chickens he wanted and that kind of thing. And that would be Dan's ideal retirement, I think. That's what she told you. There were promises that were not kept.
Sorry.
But those weren't promises that Dan and Nancy Brophy failed to keep. Those were promises that weren't kept in this courtroom. The state's numbers collapsed during testimony. No matter how it's described to you here today, they collapsed during the testimony that was presented to you.
What?
There was a lot of, it's possible. But what you were told in the prosecution's opening statement was that Nancy Brophy made claims on 10 different life insurance policies in which she is the beneficiary of over $1.4 million. It's not the way it was recast for you today. It was phrased differently. It was harmonized in a sense. But that is what you were told at the beginning of the case, and that's what the state thought was true when this prosecution began. They were wrong. That collapsed spectacularly.
What?
The prosecution led with that theory of motive. Nancy Brophy was counting on a huge insurance payout. But that's flatly untrue. One of the most misguided claims the prosecution made to you at the beginning of the case was that Dan Brophy was worth more to Nancy Brophy dead than alive. That's why we brought in Dan Rubinson, the economist, the emeritus professor from Southern Oregon. He told you that even the standard economic calculation for the loss of a man with Dan Brophy's demographic profile is that he was worth $1,133,032 to his wife. Dr. Rubinson explained that he's not allowed to consider or include intangibles. He's not allowed to factor in Dan Brophy's delightfully dry sense of humor, his wit, his extraordinary contributions around the household. And you heard about that over and over. They were extraordinary. What he presented to you is what a standard average man, the calculation that's made for a standard average man of his age and income in this part of the world. That's $1,133,032. That's significantly more than Nancy Brophy could hope to see from the insurance policies that they in fact held, not these imaginary policies that she made imaginary claims against. But the insurance actually enforced was significantly less than that. It turns out that there was some poorly described safe benefit that would be available.
Okay, so even assuming that that's true, in the end, the prosecution had come up with, like, she was going to be richer to the tune of $1.6 million altogether, which is more than $1.13 million. And also she would have had to share with Dan, right, if he was still alive. So the 1.13 million or whatever that she is suggesting that he represents by staying alive and working and doing all the housework and all that is still only going to be at best half hers, right? So I'm not buying that argument.
To her too, but there was no evidence. There was absolutely no evidence in this trial that she was ever aware of that before her husband died. And what you heard is that that would come in monthly increments that were more like a Social Security check. And if she lived to a very, very, very old age, that maybe someday that would add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it would take a considerable period of time for that to happen. And when we're talking about motive, what really matters most of all is that there was no evidence that that was something that she was aware of, that she would somehow thought might be available if her husband someday died at work.
So, but who else would have a motive? I mean, I know they don't have to prove that or whatever, but it's a huge question, right? If it wasn't Nancy, then who was it? There's no reasonable conjectures that I have heard of any reason why anybody else would harm Dan.
The bottom line is that Nancy Brophy was far better off, far, far better off with Dan Brophy in her life. Even if you look at it just in pure economic terms, even if you ignore the love, even if you ignore all of those intangibles that couldn't go into that calculation, she was better off with Dan alive. And all the state could say in response to that with Dr. Rubinson was, but what if they were going to get divorced? What if a divorce was in the offing? Well, then it wouldn't work out that way. Then that money wouldn't be coming in and those services wouldn't be coming in for all those future years. There wasn't a single witness. There was not one single witness who came in and gave you actual evidence that would support that kind of discord in the marriage, that there was even a chance, a remote chance, that the two of them were thinking about divorcing. That came.
Hi, Ruth Ann. Yeah, Ritz, I was just watching a bit of True Crime Loser on the Chandler Halderson case, and I had been wondering if people here would be interested in watching the interview of his girlfriend, who was completely innocent of any wrongdoing and had no awareness, involvement of any kind in the crime, and had completely fallen hook, line, and sinker for all of his stories. It's a fascinating interview just because of how much she drank the Chandler Halderson Kool-Aid and how genuine of a human she actually is. So if people are interested in that, let me know. I thought that was a fascinating case. Uh, the continued lies to just buy himself, like just making up the most insane lies, and literally the best that they could do was buy him another week or so, right? Crazy. So yeah, let me know if you want to watch that interview with Kat. She's great. It's a good interview.
Came only from the state's questions, and I suggest
Cool.
to you that fundamental lack of support for that theory should be very concerning to you. Steve Santos, the insurance expert, explained that the difference between his initial calculations, which presumably are why you heard about 1.4 million that she was trying to collect on in the opening statements, he explained that the difference between his initial calculations and his final numbers, the ones he testified to you about, could be explained by the fact that the project had been dumped on him a mere 24 hours or so before you heard the opening statements, before that representation was made to you. He said about 3 different times that he hadn't had sufficient time to go through that 1,000 pages or so of insurance policies. He'd done the best he could, and that it really was an awfully big project to take on such very short notice. Now, as you know, this investigation is almost 4 years old. The case itself is well over 3.5 years old. How in the world Mr. Santos ended up with a project of that size a day or two before opening statements is just unfathomable. But the bottom line is that when he testified,
I mean, maybe that's true. Maybe it isn't the greatest. Yeah, Jen in on Chandler. Yeah. So for people who don't know, Chandler killed his parents, and his brother after. Oh, was it? No, I'm thinking of Grand Amato. He killed his parents after coming up with a series of lies that became ever more outlandish that about his success. A, that he had graduated college. B, that he'd gotten a job at this place. C, that he was working for the police as a scuba diver in emergency situations. And D, that he had been hired to work at SpaceX. And all of them were lies. And and he had gone through like this elaborate making up of people and emails and email addresses had been going on for years. And when he was all about to be completely unmasked, he just killed his parents, dismembered them, and dumped their bodies.
Mr. Santos told you there was actually only 715,000 of life insurance on Dan Brophy on the day he died. The state had literally doubled, more than doubled the amount of money that they claimed Nancy Brophy sought to collect. He was also wrong about the number of policies that were enforced when Dan Brophy died. He was wrong that Ms. Brophy tried to collect on more policies than were enforced. Come back to that when we talk about John Lenz, but I want to emphasize this again. Mr. Overstreet put up a slide this morning suggesting that Nancy Brophy herself thought that all that extra insurance was enforced and had made claims against all of it. That is patently untrue. That did not happen. She did not make claims against policies for $1.4 million.
Oh my God, she is so insanely uninspired. It is completely. I mean, I'm sure that the jury by this point are obviously. I know they deliberated for 9 hours or something, but I mean, I would think by this point that they have some clear ideas. But all of this is so uninspired and boring that it's just literally filtering through my brain like white noise. Like it would be really hard to feel like you had to pay attention to all this if you were on the jury.
But Steve Santos's mistakes didn't dampen his willingness to talk down to the Brophies. He assumed that he knew better than they did themselves what they would need in the future. He talked about them almost as if they were wayward teenagers in need of his counseling. He offered the rather surprising opinion that rather than hang on to their coverage, which he eventually agreed was perfectly appropriate amount of coverage for them to have in place, that they should have given up their life insurance to avoid continued premium costs. He suggested that they could easily replace that insurance later, without mentioning that it would be both expensive and anything but certain that the coverage could be resumed again at their presumably then advanced ages. It was poor advice, but it was completely outside his lane when we're talking about what you need to know to make a decision about Nancy Brophy's fate and what happened to Dan Brophy. John Lenz, on the other hand, testified that the life insurance amounts that Ms. Maxfield spelled out for you in our opening was only off by the amount of the small loan that the Brophies had taken against the Foresters policy when money was tight a year or two earlier. She told you in opening that the policies enforced, that the life insurance enforced was $815,000, and it turns out it was $809,000. John Lenz determined that the coverage on Dan Brophy's life had never, at any point in time, been any higher than $815,000. That there was no point at which all those extra Mutual of Omaha policies were actually in force all at the same time. 815 was a perfectly appropriate amount of insurance for the Brophy couple to hold on Dan Brophy's life. John Lenz also explained to you about how the American Amicable Riders could have provided
Sorry, but like, isn't $800,000 for someone whose Nancy was 67, 68? I mean, presumably she could get by on about 50 grand a year if she was on her own, no? I mean, $800,000 would be enough to see her through. Presumably she would keep all of that in some kind of a, interest producing accounts. She was going to get his, the WCB, it's not WCB where you guys are, but the workers' compensation benefits, right? That kind of stuff. So I don't really think this is a very winning argument so far.
The potential benefit, even during Dan's lifetime, if he developed long-term health complications that his wife couldn't manage on her own. He explained how the savings components of the two different policies worked, different from each other, and how the Brophies had used one to good effect already. He even explained how utilizing that as a cash source would mean that they could pay interest on loans they took out. They could pay themselves interest on those loans, just as they did with the 401k, rather than borrowing it from a bank or a financial institution or some other source that would require that interest be paid to it. They were borrowing from their own cash reserve. Now, you don't have to decide whether or not that was the perfect insurance plan, whether it's what you would do in their circumstance. You just have to understand that they were two thoughtful people that worked this out together. And for them, knowing that they were catching up and they didn't have huge assets to rely on in retirement, for them, this was a plan that made sense. And it's a plan that made sense to John Lenz as well. The takeaways from John Lenz were that Dan Brophy was not overinsured, with $809,774 available after the Forester's loan was deducted. The Brophies were not paying too much for that insurance. They were paying $778.58 by his calculation. I don't know that any of us have heard or understood completely where they were paying over $1,000 a month comes from. But what John Lenz told you after going through all of those policies and calculating which of the payments actually went to this coverage on Dan Brophy's life, that the amount that they were paying for that was $778.58. And he further told you that that fell within the guidelines that by insurance industry standards, which are not perfectly consistent. There is no one guideline. But when he went through those guidelines with you, he told you that that's an appropriate amount. That certainly as somebody who sells insurance and has been in that industry now for years, that he didn't think that was outside the bounds at all. He also gave you a few more details, told you about the American Amicable Riders and how that would work and what the conditions would be in which that would kick in, the age at which the Americo policy could, whether it would be traded out or continued in force, the age at which that cash would be available, and that at 78, that would be about the time that people might well need that sort of extra cash bump for health-related reasons. He also explained that some of the policies that Mr. Santos had counted were plans that the Brophies had established for minor children in the family, both Susan Estrada's children and Nathaniel's. With those corrections in Mr. Santos's math, John Lenz showed that the Brophies were paying a reasonable percentage of their income for the coverage in force, and he rejected the advice, he strongly rejected the advice that the Brophies should have dropped their coverage. Instead, he took a much more realistic view of the risks of that strategy, and in his opinion, their policy choices fit their goals. I want to emphasize again here that whether or not you think that those are the insurance choices that you'll someday make for yourselves or have already made for yourselves, that isn't something on which any sort of criminal conviction should be founded. We're bringing it up because that's the theory of motive that the state led with.
I do think that this lawyer seems like a nice person. I'll give her that. She's got a nice smile, and she's not an abrasive twin like Kathy Nestor. But my goodness, she is not very inspiring.
That's why you were told she did this. And as he was getting close to closing his testimony, he was asked about whether Ms. Brophy had attempted to claim against these extra policies, whether she had really thought that, at least in her mind, that there was 1.4 million available to her. And he said no, he'd gone through thoroughly all of that paperwork, and it was clear to him that she had not done anything to try to collect against any policy that wasn't in force. And then when asked by Ms. Herman whether he had to call the companies to figure that out, maybe that was just a really tricky thing to figure out, and Mr. Santos could be excused for having made that mistake, his response in substance was, no, I just had to read the policy documents. He said, I did not call the insurance companies to determine how the policies worked. Our firm personally represents most of these companies and has for many years. I'm very familiar with them. And yes, I spent quite a bit of time looking at the policies. He did the work before he offered his opinion, and he didn't talk down either to you or to the Brophies. What you heard from the two financial experts followed the same pattern. Mr. Azor's presentation stood out for its scolding quality. He talked about Dan Brophy's financial choices in a manner that may have felt insulting even to his friends and family. Dan Brophy didn't need Robert Azor to tell him how to run his life. The tone of that presentation, or his several presentations, was that both Dan and Nancy Brophy were reckless and irresponsible and in need of a stern comeuppance from him. And the fuzzy math. The first time he testified, he couldn't tell you what the Brophy household income was. He had opinions about when they were going to run out of money. He had opinions about all sorts of things, whether it was too much for them to go out and have some pho or have some sushi. He had opinions about all sorts of things, but he hadn't even figured out what their household income was. And he hadn't done the work that Tiffany Couch had done to figure out what the patterns were and what was going on and whether there was evidence in their financial spending of a plan, of a concerted effort to wind down, to get rid of their debt, to move into a different phase of their lives. No, without doing any of that work, Mr. Azor testified to you both times that they were essentially on the brink of financial disaster. He also told you when he came back this past week that Dan Brophy worked less at Avamere in 2018 and 2017. But I'd ask you, while you're back there looking through the exhibits and considering all of this again, to just take a moment or two to glance through the Avamere time cards. It's the Defense Exhibit 256, and it's the full set of time cards for the year leading up to Dan Brophy's death. So you get more than half a year of 2017 and less than half a year of 2018, but a year in total. And if you divide the first by 7 and the second by 5, and look at those, actually, the running tally of hours over on the right-hand side, you'll see that Dan Brophy was actually, he clocked more hours in 2018, about 2 more hours a week than he had in 2007.
Sorry, I'm just checking. So Mary says she talks way too fast. Slow down. So it's sped up to 1.3. If people are having trouble with that, I can slow it down, but I feel like it's going to take too long. Yeah, I think it needs to be sped up. Okay, so if it's too fast, you let me know, but I think it's okay as it is.
17. He also, when he came back this past week, offered some formulas about his projections going forward, but when asked what numbers he plugged into the formulas to try to figure out why there was such a discrepancy in the numbers that we were getting, his answer essentially was, oh, I didn't know you'd want to see the numbers. I didn't bring those. I'm certain I'm right, but no, I can't tell you how I got to that number. I'm just telling you that they would have been broke by the end of the year. He did make one very important concession, though, during his testimony, and that was that if the Brophies had sold their house and they'd moved into a home that they could own free and clear, that would resolve their problems. That where they sat on the day Dan died on June 2nd of 2018, that they were in a position then that merely taking equity out of the house, getting a smaller house, or maybe not even a smaller house, a house further out of town, a cheaper house, a nice house, but something that they really truly could afford, and getting rid of that mortgage, that would make all the difference.
One of the things that I keep thinking about though is that, like, yeah, maybe, I mean, obviously, if they sold their house and they were able to buy a place free and clear with the money that they got back from the sale of the house, um, sure, they wouldn't have to make that big mortgage payment every month. But from what I am remembering, they only had like about 160,000 in that house at that point. And I mean, I guess maybe things are different there, but I mean, 160 grand here is not going to buy you much free and clear. Certainly not going to buy you a property with a garden and all that kind of stuff. And also, I don't see any evidence. I didn't see any evidence that either one of them changed their spending habits or stopped, living beyond their means. So I'm not sure that everything would have been just fine if they just sold the house. I just don't buy that argument either.
And you did hear from Paul Johnston last week also, the realtor neighbor familiar with their property, the Brophy's property, lived right down the street. He said he thought they could sell it for as much as 700,000 if they cleared out the backyard and they returned it so it looked like a normal house, a property that would be attractive to many buyers.
Okay, so we're supposed to take the word of the neighbor down the street, but we're not going to take the word of the other witnesses. So that's interesting.
And Richard Freimark, of course, had come in earlier. He also was a realtor. He thought that they could sell it for even more if they did that. Of course, they would have to clear out the blackberries. But if they did that and they investigated whether it could be partitioned, they might even be able to make a little more than 700,000.
Yeah.
And he told you that he was the one who recommended Nick White, that he was the one who had suggested that that was the way to put that all in motion. Now, when Ms. Brophy testified, she testified that she relied on that input. And it may be that she confused which of them had spoken directly to Nick White. But does it really matter? Richard Freimark told you that Nick White was the one that he had recommended and that would be the way that it would play out. And even Mr. White told you, as did everybody else who saw that backyard or heard about it, the first thing that had to happen was that the blackberries would have to go. They just had to be restored to a more reasonable status before anything could really move forward, before anybody was going to look at that property and think about purchasing it at a good price.
So she's saying that, oh, maybe it was Dan that spoke to her. Does it really matter? But there's no evidence that Dan did speak to him, right? What we heard was that Nancy claimed that she spoke to this person that had been recommended to her. And then that person came and testified and said, no, never heard of her. And in fact, we searched our records to see if there was any evidence that she had been in contact with the office at all. And I do feel like with the name Brophy, they might have come up with we got a call from a person named Dan Brophy, but not Nancy Brophy. So again, not buying that one.
So the one thing that we agree Robert Azor was absolutely right about is that selling their house on 108th and moving to a place that they could purchase for cash was their ticket to a financially stable retirement, a financially stable future. If they'd maximize the value of that property, as Freimark and Johnston had recommended, a sale of 700,000 would have netted them at least 400,000 because the remaining mortgage was about $250,000. So even if you take out all of the costs that can attend a sale, it really is a pretty conservative figure to think that they would have had 400,000 left over. You can find some pretty well-constructed, lovely homes in Oregon if you're willing to get outside of Portland for $400,000.
Except that the house sold for somewhere in the neighborhood of $500,000 and they only had like $160,000 equity in their house. So saying that it could have sold for that amount when we know that it didn't sell for that amount is again a weird argument and another one that I'm not buying.
Actually, for considerably less than $400,000. Tiffany Couch performed, as you know, as you saw, a much more thorough analysis than Robert Azor. I'm sorry, it's Azor. She shows her work. You can follow her math because it's complete. She spells it out. Her exhibits were very detailed. In fact, she prepared one exhibit that we have available to you that gives you all of the bank detail from all of the combined accounts. It's probably much, much more than you want to look through, but it's right there for you. If you want to check anything she told you, it's right there for you. The court rules, as we talked about at the very beginning, and Wadir, and at least most of your panels, the court rules don't allow for her to testify a second time, to respond to Mr. Azor's testimony during the state's rebuttal case. However, luckily, she was well prepared the first time and very thorough. and she was able to provide you with fully documented numbers to support her conclusions. And her primary conclusions were that the Brophies were fast retiring their debt. They would have been debt-free but for the mortgage by the end of 2018. That Dan Brophy was making considerably more than Robert Azor acknowledged because so much of his OCI income was going directly into his 401k. That speaks to retirement planning. Nancy Brophy was bringing in a growing and substantial income from her Medicare sales, enough so that she contributed very large cash infusions at the beginning of each year after she switched to Medicare. So 2017, 2018, some very large cash infusions, almost 20,000 just in that 1 month alone. And you'll see those figures in the exhibits. I think it was 19,000 one year and 17 another. But in addition to that, she was bringing in about 3,000 a month each of the other months. So she too was making a very substantial contribution with the switch to Medicare to getting the two of them on much more solid footing going forward.
Ritz is saying, I loved Overstreet's precise account of when she stalked him that morning, pointing out all her moves. She must have been enraged. Yeah, I was thinking that it was super effective, and I don't even live there, right? And the jury does live there. So they're like looking at those maps and looking at the video cam footage and stuff like that, and like those people know where that is. They can see all that, right? Like if it's effective to somebody who doesn't even live there, just imagine if it was all showing and describing streets that you're familiar with, like just how much that would bring it alive.
Dan's second job at Avamere, Nancy didn't make him take that job. I mean, you heard Tanya Medlin talk about how he would sing at work. It was 6 minutes away from home, and she gave him all the high-paying shifts. She gave him the cherry shifts. Having that extra income come in meant that he was able to pay down those high interest credit cards that he'd been carrying for a very long time. He had those almost paid off completely. He was making good big payments against that second mortgage. They were doing all sorts of things that must have felt like a tremendous relief to them.
It seems like Dan was paying down their debt, not his debt, and it doesn't seem like Nancy was doing much of anything. I mean, she was doing the Medicaid, and sure, $20,000 at the beginning of the year, but that's not like a huge amount for, there was like long periods of time where she wasn't bringing in anything, right? Because the Medicare is a seasonal thing, as far as I understand it, right?
He was making more at Avamere, it appears, than he was making at OCI. And he was working close to home, and he obviously really enjoyed Tanya Medlin. This couch was able to tell you that the Brophies were on the path to good financial health by June of 2018, that they were in a far better position than they'd been 2 years earlier, and that their financial decisions, even with respect to taking out the loan against the 401k, were sound decisions. Their decisions with respect to insurance, the loan against the 401k, the loan against the forester's policy, and especially their decision to aggressively pay down that debt, those were all very sound financial decisions. And if they hadn't been so aggressive in trying to pay down that debt, they wouldn't have had other cash flow problems. Part of that was a function of the fact that they'd let the credit cards get too high and they had to retire them. But they didn't have to pay it off right then in the amounts that they were paying it off. That shows a commitment, a really serious commitment to getting that debt out of their lives. And of course, it's common sense that anybody who works that hard to get their credit card paid off is not going to want to go back and charge against them again. But they did have that too available. They weren't desperate. They weren't in a position where they were just on the precipice and about to tip off into the deep abyss. There were a number of competing narratives in this trial, actually an unusual number. The one that stands out as the most absurd is this persistent insistence that the Brophies never would have planned for retirement, that unlike virtually every other household in the entire country, that retirement just wasn't a thing for them. Dan Brophy couldn't care less about retiring, couldn't care less about being comfortable or being safe as he aged. And no matter how many times you hear that from the prosecution, remember that even people like Dan Brophy's own mother said, well, he was 64. Of course, I imagine he was starting to think about retirement. Who wouldn't? That's an excellent question. Who wouldn't? Who wouldn't be starting to think about it? And that takes you.
Sorry, didn't she just say, even his mom said he was 64? I imagine he was starting to think about retirement. So that's not evidence that he was, though, is it? And also, I mean, I'm not sure what that proves anyway.
Years of preparation, as you all know. You can't just snap your fingers and decide one day, oh, well, I didn't save enough money and I've still got all those credit cards and yeah, there's some impediments, but I think I'll just, take the leap and retire now anyway. No, what Ms. Maxfield told you in the opening is that they had started a plan that was a plan that was going to continue with Mr. Brophy working And their hope, their expectation was that he would be able to work through the age of 70, through the time that he could collect the maximum Social Security benefit, because they didn't have a huge amount of money in the bank. That extra year or two of waiting for Social Security might be really beneficial to them. And so they were going to try to hold on for that long. But they had started to plan. They had started to put that 5 or 6 year plan into action. So what Ms. Maxfield told you in her opening, it was that plan was this, the retirement plan was this, that Nancy Brophy would begin to take her own Social Security benefits, because she now was 67, about to turn 68. And she would build, that would bring in a little bit of extra money, and that would help because they were still at a point that cash was a little tight. She would build a book of Medicare commissions from her new career focus on Medicare. That Dan, and this is what you were told by Ms. Maxfield in opening, that Dan Brophy would work at OCI for about 5 more years until he could collect the full Social Security amount as he approached 70. And that they would investigate subdividing their lot and then sell their house, and that they were hoping to do that in 2018. The state, though, turned that on its head, or tried to turn that on its head, and asked witness after witness whether Dan had told him he was about to retire. That question was a red herring. It's a misrepresentation of what you were told in our opening. The plan was for Dan to work until he was about 70, until he could maximize his Social Security payment, and that was about 5 more years. The Brophies were financially astute enough to know that that could matter. And Dan did love to teach. He loved OCI. He enjoyed it. He knew the stimulation was good for him. That's absolutely true. He wasn't ready to quit, and his wife didn't want him to quit. They just needed to get serious about laying plans for a comfortable future.
Yeah, exactly.
There has been a lot of insinuation in this case about what Nancy Brophy was up to and whether their marriage was really as healthy as it appeared to be to everybody, even the people who knew them best. But not a single witness has offered even a shred of support for the prosecution's insinuation or supposition that the Brophies planned to separate or divorce. Not a single witness has offered any support for the idea that Nancy Brophy had fallen out of love with Dan Brophy, that money suddenly mattered more to her than her husband. Now, you heard her testify that she has a degree in economics. She's obviously a very astute woman. She's obviously a very social woman. She has so many friends and so many resources. If she was all about money, if the only thing that mattered to her is how much her husband made, if his happiness was nothing, if being creative was nothing, if the fact that he was a world-class chef was nothing, do you think she couldn't have moved on before she was hitting her 25th year of marriage to him? That makes no sense. That's just an absurd suggestion. There is absolutely no evidence to back that up. It's just, well, we're sure she shot him, so she had to have a motive. So, well, here's one, maybe this fits. But there's nothing in her behavior that supports that. Nothing that, and I'm not asking you just to rely on her testimony, but the testimony of all of the other people who came in. There's just absolutely nothing to support that. What if, and the possibility, so what if, let's play this game. What if none of what you've heard from all these bright, caring, thoughtful people is true? And instead, the Brophies were secretly harboring plans to separate after 24 plus, what was it, 24 years, 10 months, and some odd number of days. What if after all that time, they were secretly harboring plans to separate? What if, the state's theory seems to go, what if
Sorry, I was doing it again. I almost started blabbing with the mute on. Thank you so much, boss lady. That's so incredibly kind of you. You already do so much for the channel. I really appreciate that. I just wanted to say about the thing about, again, I'm just not buying her arguments, right? Like she's saying that Dan, or that, obviously, why would she suddenly, after 25 years, decide that money was more important to her than, this world-class chef and this, whatever soulmate relationship that she had with Dan. And I think it's I just think that's a very weak argument, because obviously, to my mind, she was just using Dan anyway. These people treat other humans as though they're objects, and when those objects fail to deliver what the promise of the object is, they are discarded. This is a very, very classic narcissist behavior. So again, I am not buying any of this very nicely dressed and well coiffed lawyer's arguments.
What if Dan Brophy, instead of being the good man virtually every witness described him to be, what if he harbored a secret, cruel, selfish side? And he had decided that they should refuse to monetize their most valuable asset, their home, as they approached older age.
Okay, but Nancy's cruel, selfish side isn't a secret. God, it's like all the efforts she makes to cover it up are not enough.
They should eschew the financial stability that would result from selling their home. What if Dan Brophy didn't want to monetize the one thing that could bring them true financial stability in their later years? Remember, Mr. Roloff told you on the day he died, Dan Brophy's phone, his cell phone, the one with the chicken picture on the back, the rooster picture on the back, his contact for his wife, what came up on his phone was Nancy, the love of my life. But what if all of that, none of that?
Oh my God, right? That just reminded me of Eric Richins with the My Princess. Trusting and believing it, right? Yeah, like Dan was the secret bully, right? Yeah. I don't think so.
That was true. What if, rather than waiting to move forward with the most ambitious landscaping, the expensive part that required heavy machinery, what if instead of just waiting until the weather turned and the ground was solid enough to bring in all that heavy machinery, what if instead that delay between the work that was done in the early winter and then the work that was resumed in the spring, what if that was all just because Dan Brophy was stalling? He didn't really want to do that work. He didn't really want to get rid of those blackberries. He was stalling because, well, having taken out that loan from his 401k, he decided he didn't really want to do the yard work, but he wanted to spend the money on chicken feed. What if rather than needing some time to figure out how to tackle that Rubik's Cube of a problem he had ahead of him in cleaning out that house, cleaning out that garage, cleaning out that basement, what if just rather than having to take some time to figure out how they were going to do this, how they were going to stage this, Dan Brophy just put that whole plan entirely out of his mind. He had no intention of proceeding with it. And what if he wanted that property so much, with all of its encroaching bramble of blackberry canes, its blackberries that had overwhelmed him? Several witnesses told you he'd become overwhelmed by them. It almost overtaken the house itself. What if he wanted that property so much that he decided that both he and Nancy would work right through their 70s and their 80s at the same brisk pace they've been keeping up in their 60s in order to keep paying that mortgage?
Okay, that's ridiculous. Like she's just making stuff up now. We're just speculating on what if Dan was a completely different person than he was. You might find some trouble with watching it on double speed, Fiona, because the lawyer is already sped up to 1.3. So not sure how that's going to work for you, but this seems weird to me, this total speculating. Like, what if Dan just decided that he was going to start cracking the whip over Nancy and making her get out of bed in the morning and go to work? What if Dan had a complete personality transplant? Again, not buying it.
Because that's what it would take. Dan Brophy couldn't afford to stay in that house, and he knew it. He could do the math. He was good at math. He was so good at math that both the students and faculty sought him out to learn how to do the math right. Nancy Brophy could do the math. She's an econ major. They both, each of them, had to have figured out individually and in concert with each other, they had to have figured out with that $250,000 balance that they had left on that Wells Fargo mortgage, that they would have to make large additional payments, probably on the order of $16,000 extra on top of their mortgage payments, on top of the monthly obligation. They'd have to pay about another $16,000 a year if they ever wanted to own that house free and clear.
Why? Where is the evidence that they would have figured that out? The only evidence we have so
That would take
about their finances is that they both sucked enormously at behaving responsibly with money. God.
Another decade of their lives of making those kinds of extra payments to get to the point that they had that mortgage paid off. And until they did, they couldn't retire. They better not have a health problem. There better be nothing that slowed the two of them down. They better keep chugging away for that whole decade at the pace described, because they had $250,000 left to pay off on that mortgage.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, right? It was a $400,000 house, and they'd put about $160,000 into it. It's interesting because yesterday I barely interrupted the prosecutor at all to comment because there was nothing to comment on. He was just doing such a great job. I thought this was going to be a little bit like that more, I guess, but I am just very unimpressed so far by the arguments. I mean, she's doing a good job with what she has, I guess, but yeah, I'm not buying any of these arguments.
Dan was about to turn 64. It was June. He was going to turn 64 at the end of the month. Nancy was about to turn 68 a little bit earlier. To work for another decade at the hard pace that they had kept up in 2017 and 2018 would mean that they would both be working at that rigorous physical pace until Nancy was 78 and Dan was 74. And if they didn't, the mortgage alone was about $1,700 something, $1,800 at that point. Their Social Security pyramid, if they were in the house, that they hadn't gotten access to any of that equity, any of that cash, the Social Security was going to be eaten up. A huge portion of what they had coming in every month was going to be eaten up to try to pay off the balance of that mortgage. The cash flow that they experienced in 2016, 2015, 16, 17, that cash crunch would have been nothing compared to what they were looking at down the road once their income started to evaporate, as they do for all of us, inevitably. Dan Brophy also knew biology. In fact, he'd majored in biology. He knew it would be a shaky plan indeed to assume that his body would hold up to the rigors of working on his feet. He was working in a hot kitchen on his feet. Through his mid-70s, maybe he'd pull that off. Maybe he couldn't. He knew that. He knew it would be an even shakier plan to assume that his wife could hold up enough to work to the age of 78. What decent man would pin his future on the insistence that his wife work until she was 78, just so he could live in a house overwhelmed by an enormous bramble of blackberries? That's been known to happen. There are codgers like that in the world. We all know that there are outliers, that there are men who would do that. But what you know from having heard from all these witnesses is that Dan Brophy was not one of them. That's not who he was. He was an honorable man. He was a loving husband in an exemplary marriage. He loved Nancy Brophy, and he sought to protect her in many ways, large and small.
Yeah, true for the first time. Nancy or Dan Brophy was a stand-up dude. Absolutely.
State's entire theory seems to be premised on the idea that he was not a man, that he was a man who would not hesitate for a minute to insist that his wife work until she was 78 because he said so.
I'm sorry. I mean, I didn't watch the whole trial, I have to admit it, but I did not get the impression that the prosecution was dissing Dan in any way, from what I saw. Yeah, I found the judge, that's what I was saying about the judge yesterday, very lackluster, like just not even. He seems more interested in breaks and that sort of thing than in actually being engaged with the case. But I mean, I guess, I don't know. If people aren't, what is the role of the judge if nobody's complaining, right? If nobody's objecting? Fun, hey? My internet can be a bit spotty here where I am, so I'm often back and forth using my phone as a hotspot. Forgot about the judge entirely, says Jem, right? Yeah, judge who? Yeah, I thought the prosecution did a great job. I don't know where she's getting this idea that they're suggesting that Dan was just a bad person.
That's a fictional Dan Brophy. That's not the Dan Brophy you heard about from any witness who knew him. Not from Matt Gitchell or Delilah Marvell or Jack Brophy or Karen Brophy or Susan Estrada or Nathaniel Stillwater or Melanie Hamrickson, Tanya Medlin. Not from anybody. Not from a single person who knew him. The Dan Brophy you heard about, the Dan Brophy who actually graced this earth, was a much better man than that. That Dan Brophy adored his wife. He wanted her to live the last decades of her life as she deserved to live them. He wanted to enjoy his last decades with her, wandering the woods, whiling away the evenings with a glass of wine on the porch, living in a house they could manage with no debt, a house they could keep up even when they reached the point, as they inevitably would, that the only income coming in would be Social Security. A relatively stress-free life compared to the financially tumultuous couple of years they'd had after In Good Taste closed, and then almost simultaneously, Portland Nursery and Bob's Red Mill stopped offering their cooking programs for the home chef. He didn't want to go back to that tumult any more than his wife did. Dan Brophy was not a financially reckless or emotionally callous husband. He was a great husband, an almost perfect husband. His worst fault, in his wife's eyes, was that he didn't believe in locking doors or windows, their house or car. You heard that in the back and forth between Dr. Warford, the defense psychologist, and Mr. Overstreet, when he challenged her about the years and years of text messages that she'd reviewed. Dan Brophy's worst failing as a husband in his wife's eyes, the only time that she came close to getting crabby with him in that long exchange of text messages, was that he didn't lock up the house or car, but instead left the windows to the house open. The primary theme throughout the prosecution, let me just note there that it's important to see in that exchange even that Nancy Brophy she'd started to get alarmed about safety, about personal safety. And that was something that maybe she was feeling a little bit more than her husband. It's not unusual for women that age to start thinking about vulnerabilities, but that comes out in that exchange that you heard between Mr. Overstreet and Dr.
I understood that it didn't have anything to do with her age, but it had to do with the school shooting. And the school shooting was what, really drove it home to her that if there was a Civil War, that the people on the left were going to be outmatched by the people on the right who own all the guns. Isn't that the argument? Not that she's old and insecure.
Dr. Warford. So a primary theme throughout the entire prosecution was that she, though, was engaged in a lengthy, ongoing, and clandestine plan to murder her husband. According to the state, the plan was executed one secret at a time. First, you heard that Ms. Brophy secretly rented a storage unit. There was all sorts of insinuation about Dan didn't know there was a storage unit. And yet, you'll see if you look in the on-point account, I don't remember if we have this call out as Exhibit 380 or whether that's the whole statement for the month, but you'll see that the public storage was being paid for out of their joint on-point account. Not much of a secret.
Okay, but I don't think that proves anything. The fact that there's one text saying that they're going to go see the storage or something like that, that could literally mean that they were going to go look into storage, not that they had storage. And that if something's getting paid, coming out of their monthly account, like not everybody checks every item on their monthly account as it goes out. And by all accounts, these people were not paying attention to their spending. So again, not buying that one either.
And then we have the text exchange that you'll see. Our yard guy is coming by at 2 today. Okay, does that mean we wait on storage, to wait to visit storage? Yes.
Right? It doesn't mean anything.
Seems a little silly if you're hiding the storage unit from him to ask him to go there to visit it with you.
Yeah, it doesn't prove that they had storage, though, does it? I mean, the most that it could prove is that they were going to go check it out. The possibility of getting storage.
It's much more consistent with the idea that they were trying to figure out how they could get their house cleared out, how they could sell it. They certainly weren't going to sell it with all that stuff in the house. They're trying to figure out an economical way to get the house cleaned out so that they could sell it and then take the cash from the sale to buy a new place, a place that they could get for cash.
So I don't get, she is trying to paint the story of this perfect, happy marriage. And yet it seems like their perfect, happy marriage has been perfect and happy, or it's been running on fumes, basically. So they're both like, I mean, nobody's perfect, obviously, and no marriage is perfect. But to suggest that everything is fine in a marriage after 24 years, when it is revealed that the finances in that marriage are an absolute dog's dinner, does not suggest that the relationship and everything was fine and wonderful, right? It suggests that these people had issues that they were not addressing.
You also heard about the secret purchase of the gun kit, a purchase made on Christmas Eve after Dan Brophy arrived home from his shift at Avamere. Admittedly, somewhat frivolous present that Nancy Brophy got for herself. But that too is in the on-point records. That too was in the joint account for Dan Brophy to see. And in fact, not only was he home from work, you can look at the times on his time card when he punches out and the messages and figure out that would have been purchased right about the time he got home. Not an hour before, not hours before, but right about the time he got home. But it also was delivered to their home.
Sorry, I just don't see that this proves anything either. If she bought it, even if she did buy it and he knew that she bought it and whatever, she could have told him the same exact lies, right? That this was for a research for her book. And I mean, it seems like he was pretty willing to indulge her in what she wanted, right? So again, just not buying it. It's not proof. It's not proof of anything.
There's another item that was delivered right to their home, not to a secret post office box, not to anything else. That came right to their home and was paid for right out of their joint account.
Right?
It also,
I mean, so far, the only reasonable doubt I'm seeing so far is reasonable doubt in every single argument that they're making.
Wasn't a secret from others. Linda Smith testified that Nancy Brophy had mentioned it to her ahead of time. Jesse Smith, Darla Lukenbaugh, Sue Lute were all aware that Nancy Brophy had this idea about the gun kit. If it were something that she had gotten, not as a writing device, but as something she thought she could use to execute this dastardly plot, would it make any sense at all for her to be buying it out of a joint account and talking not only with her husband, but with all these other people about it? her description of what she was up to with those gun parts and her distinguishing between here's the gun we got for protection, here's the one that we got because I was starting to get really nervous about what was going on in society. I was on a society-wide level and also just on a personal level. I was starting to get nervous about whether we were really safe and whether we were naive not to have a gun. There was that, and then she clearly distinguished between that and the writing devices and told you that the gun kit and the slide were writing devices. And she didn't say that they didn't overlap. You were told earlier today that somehow her testimony could be interpreted to mean that she was saying, oh, no, the only thing that happened, well, there was the gun kit, and then I stopped thinking about that, and then there was the gun that we purchased, and then, no, like anybody else, those things overlap. Those things can be happening simultaneously, but be completely separate from each other, be completely distinct purposes and thoughts and motivations. At the beginning of the case, the prosecution even contended that whole big project in the backyard was a secret, something of a secret, not a joint project. There were questions suggesting that the landscapers were hired without Dan's consent, probably without even his knowledge. But the text messages show otherwise. And the testimony of James Denny and Tamara Olive shows that just isn't true. Both of them came in and told you, and James Denny gave just the most vivid, wonderful description of the way he worked out a piece with Dan Brophy and how completely a part of that planning Dan Brophy was, how integral to that planning he was. There's also the supposed secret about the gun show, the expo center, the gun that was purchased there. Nancy Brophy had become alarmed about crime, about shootings, about the rising levels of violence in society, about theft, intrusion, and become alarmed about a lot of things that involve personal safety. It all ran together for her, and she began to think that they were naive, that her whole lifelong aversion to having guns was perhaps now, at least in light of the way society had evolved, maybe that was a bad decision. Maybe she had missed something. She especially began to think that when she recognized that some of the good, capable people she knew and respected owned and even carried weapons for protection. She did worry about Dan's safety. She worried about her own. And Dan cared that she was concerned. He responded as you would expect a partner would. He talked it over with her, weighing the pros and cons, considering their options. He talked it over with his friend and colleague, Tanya Medlin. He talked it over with his friend and colleague, Tony Hall. And then he talked it over again with his wife. He knew that she was going to the expo center, and he would have been welcome to go with her. The gun they purchased was the make and model that Brett Glendenning, the man from the gun show, the then J&B employee, it was the same make and model that he recommended to them, and it turned out to be the same make and model that Tony Hall had thought would be a good choice. None of that was any secret to Dan. Nancy even discussed the purchase in advance with her mother-in-law and with Tanya Medlin. Now, having met both of them and knowing how fond they were of Dan and how much time they spent with Dan, if you were going to secretly buy a gun that you didn't want Dan Brophy to know about, the two people you would not tell would be Tanya Medlin and Karen Brophy. And then there's the slide.
Okay, again, I'm just not sure what this argument is, like where she thinks she's going with it, because again, I mean, I will admit I have not watched the whole trial, but to me, whether or not Dan knew that she bought the Glock and knew that she bought the other thing, her whole defense is that one was for protection and the other was for her books. So she could just as easily have said those things to Dan, right? Like what? None of these are winning arguments at all.
The slide was purchased again with a debit card in the name of Nancy Brophy from the On Point account, from that joint account. And it was shipped to the Brophy's home by the Postal Service with the seller requiring signature. It was a signature required delivery when the parcel was delivered. Now, when Kelsey Guay testified about the CSLI, she seemed to say that it could have been either one who could have taken delivery of the slide that day. And I think you have to check your notes. I did not go back to the transcript to verify this, but I think she said that Nancy, in response to a question from us, that Nancy Brophy had never gotten as far as McMinnville that day, that she'd been somewhere around, closer to Beaverton and Hillsborough. And the implication, as I understood her testimony, was that either one could have signed for that slide. But Josiah Roloff came in with his own set of CSLI exhibits, and they clearly show that Nancy Brophy's phone was out as far as McMinnville that day, that she was in Sheridan and then she was in McMinnville, and that Dan Brophy's phone was home. Presumably he was home with it. His phone was home almost all day. And in this exhibit, you'll see that there's a time, that one of the slides, and I think it might be page 7 of that exhibit.
I mean, maybe Dan just wasn't wearing his bra that day. So he didn't bring his phone.
I don't have the exhibit number written down here, but it's the Josiah Roloff CSLI from February 28th, that Nancy Brophy appears to have been either in McMinnville still or just starting back to home at 2:56, which is about the time that they estimate that delivery occurred. And it appears really impossible from the work that he did that Nancy could have been the one who was home to sign for it that day.
Again, so what?
So the suggestions that you heard, and you heard them repeatedly, were not supported by actual evidence. Those were questions.
Okay, so this whole line of everything that she's doing here just goes completely against the whole defense. The whole defense is that what? It was nothing what? I mean, I had this and I had this, and this was for these reasons, and I talked to people about it. It was all out in the open. There was no secret. It was no secret that I took the gun apart. There were no secrets here. And yet now she's like trying to say that the fact that maybe Dan was the one that received the package that contained the slide and barrel is proof that she didn't do it. I mean, first of all, how do we know that he would even know what was in the box, that he was even remotely interested in what she might be ordering offline? I mean, it seems like she might have been ordering things offline all the time, right? I assume that if the jury hasn't fallen asleep by this point, they are also capable of having these thoughts and realizations. It just seems like it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense based on what their argument is, which is, what's the big deal? It wasn't a surprise. Why would she be trying to hide it from Dan if there was nothing to hide?
Those were insinuations, those were suggestions, but they were specious suggestions. They were not supported by evidence. Nancy Brophy did not hide all these things from her husband. She simply did not do that. And you have no evidence before you to think that she was sneaking around and behaving in that way in her marriage. Now, the standout example.
Except that she doesn't cook. So she's not going to be in there slicing the garlic with a razor like Polly.
Of deception in this trial, of course, was the decision to bring in Andrea Jacobs and present her to you. Duplicity come to life right here in this courtroom. She's as untrustworthy as a convicted criminal could be. She had the gall to impersonate an IRS agent. She showed up uninvited, willing to work uncompensated for Dr. Haney to help him improve his medical billing procedures. She feigned innocence when it came to any sort of benefit that she might get for this. She feigned a lack of knowledge of the significant legal trouble that she's in, that there's at least one active, perhaps more than one active criminal investigation headed her way. She even pretended to be somewhat disinterested in what benefit she might hope to receive when she agreed to talk to Detective Merrill in Texas before they brought her up here. She did admit to you, though, grudgingly, quite grudgingly, that he told her in Texas that it would be of benefit to her to share information about this case. And you know from our exhibit 430 that the Oregon Department of Justice, in fact, had already written a letter to her lawyer, and her lawyer had sent it to her.
Lil Whisker says, I'm sure the one spending the majority of the income was Nancy. I get the impression that Dan did spend some money too, but my feeling about it is that Dan spent money on like things that were spending money on that he could then later turn over for more money, or that he could in some way turn them into money. And Nancy spent money on frivolously on things for her. That's kind of my understanding of it.
Telling her, informing her that there was this new active investigation that was about to be prosecuted. You also know from an exhibit that I don't think you've seen yet, but you will have available to you in the jury room, that she's been convicted of the offenses described. She's been convicted of bank fraud, filing a false tax return, false impersonation of an employee of the United States, that would be the IRS agent, and aggravated identity theft. The only thing you can know with confidence about her is that she is so untrustworthy that the US Department of Justice actually gave a federal prosecutor permission to come into this courtroom where another entity is prosecuting a woman for murder, gave her permission to come into this courtroom to testify against Andrea Jacobs.
Does anybody know what this part is about? The Ann Woodward case. What's the Ann Woodward case, Elizabeth?
Donna Maddox that prosecutor, that former federal prosecutor, told you that her opinion of Ms. Jacobs' truthfulness is that she's consistently untruthful. Patrick McCarthy, the doctor out in LeGrand, told you that his opinion is that she's extraordinarily untruthful. Rhonda Slavic, the woman from California who lived and worked in Oregon for a period and actually hosted Ms. Jacobs in her home, she told you she's not capable of telling the truth. And Curtis Haney, when asked about his opinion of her truth, takes little imagination. Having seen the layout that Mr. Hersey showed you of the dorms in which they were held, that Andrea Jacobs either read a legal paper that Ms. Brophy had as we were preparing for an upcoming hearing with Mr. Howard, or she eavesdropped on Nancy Brophy as she talked with one of us on that professional phone you could see in the jail photographs, right out in the open, right out in the middle of where everybody else, the milieu in those jail pods. And keep in mind as you evaluate whether that's the most likely way she came up with this information, that the years, the months in which all of this would have happened, that they could have been housed together, were during the pandemic. And you can imagine that jail visits, professional jail visits, were few and far between during that time. It's possible that she both read some legal papers and she eavesdropped on some legal conversations, hoping to escape serving her full sentence for the fraud and deception. But from that, she constructed, she read, she overheard enough to construct a small story that she could pretend Nancy Brophy told her herself. That never happened. Nancy Brophy never had that conversation with Andrea Jacobs. There was no conversation between the two of them about the distance of the muzzle from the shirt. None of that ever happened. And Andrea Jacobs is a liar, a person who would rather tell a lie than tell the truth. Let's review some of the other testimony that was unreliable. You were told that what happened at OCI the morning of June 2nd couldn't possibly have been a burglary, a robbery, some kind of theft, a property offense.
So it seems like their defense is that the prosecution didn't prove their case, and they're just poking holes in the prosecutor's case. They don't have a case of their own. So, I mean, fair enough. It's often the case, but yeah, I mean, it's whether or not it's up to the jury to decide if the testimony is reliable in the end, right?
Nothing was missing. You were told nothing at all was missing. You were told that by multiple witnesses affiliated with the state.
Affiliated with the state. Ooh.
But don't let it be lost on you that you were also told that Dan's red book bag, which he always had with him, wasn't ever recovered, that seemed to have gone missing. And who knows how much liquor, wine, or other attractive offerings inside of OCI might have been taken.
What? She's saying there was stuff stolen that nobody was accounted for, that nobody ever came forward and said, oh yeah, this stuff was stolen because it was such a mess in there they didn't notice. Is that the point?
You'll see when you get back into the jury room, this exhibit 217 that we have up now in front of us. I want you to look carefully at that. You'll see that in sort of the upper left of the photo, there's an entire big tray. It's bigger even than a school lunch tray. It's probably 2 feet by 3 feet. And it appears to be filled with bottles of liquor, absolutely filled with bottles of liquor. And then if you look into the kitchen where Chef Damon was working, off to the right, just look through that narrow doorway, you'll see on the second shelf up from the ground, straight over it, there appears to be a whole nother big tray, the same size, equally filled with bottles of liquor. Now, Brian Wilkie and some of his colleagues from OCI told you that, well, that night, that afternoon, when the police finally left, when everybody finally left, they did an inventory. They went through OCI and they figured out that nothing had been taken.
Okay, I'm also just going to say, right? So, and they described it, the prosecution describes it as an execution, and it absolutely is an execution. So if somebody came in there and they were going to pinch a bunch of bottles of half full liquor off the shelf, don't you think that shooting him in the back would be enough, right? That they wouldn't need to then come up and flip him over and shoot him in the chest as well, that they could probably get by with the one shot in the back. Just saying, like, if you're there to steal stuff, why did you execute the guy?
Yeah, couldn't have been that. Couldn't have been that. But if you look at these photos, including the one that we have up right now, you'll see that has to be just a gross overstatement of what they did. They could not possibly have inventoried that place. They could not possibly have really gotten a handle on what might have been missing. And I would suggest specifically that liquor is something to pay attention to.
Where is her evidence that they couldn't possibly have inventoried it? How is that possible? I mean, they're running a school and they probably have a restaurant, right, in the school, don't they? Most culinary places. They would need to know their inventory. They would need to know what they have. They would have to like do restaurants and places like that do regular inventory. She has not provided any evidence whatsoever that they couldn't possibly have taken inventory. What a ridiculous thing to say. Now I think she's ridiculous. Now she's pissing me off. So now I'm engaged.
We're going to come back to this in just a little bit, but from talking with the two detectives who headed this up, both Detective Posey and specifically Detective Merrill, and maybe Detective Posey did not support this, but Detective Merrill agreed that he had even taken a note after he talked to Oscar Taylor about that Oscar Taylor that morning had somewhere, Detective Merrill didn't think it was OCI. He thought maybe it was someplace else, but right in the same time frame that this happened, that Oscar Taylor said he'd taken Cabernet and a candle from someplace nearby. Don't underestimate how much of a motivator alcohol could be. And we just can't possibly know what other things would be of value, what other things could have been going on. But to say that there just absolutely was no evidence at all that something could have been taken is disingenuous. So there were some other things that Mr. Wilkie said while we're talking about him that I think are worth reviewing. He did seem to contradict Officer Wells, who told you that she hugged Nancy Brophy and cried with her while they were waiting for the detectives to be ready for Ms. Brophy's death notification in the RV. But Officer Wells told that story in a very credible way. She remembers breaking out into tears and that Nancy was crying. Mr. Wilkie also contradicted Nicole Barlow, the TIPS victim's assistance person who counseled Nancy Brophy right after she talked with the detectives. She said that she didn't meet Nancy Brophy right when she came in, but that she heard Nancy cry out, that she heard a wailing. And even Mr. Wilkie says, even though he contradicts them about her emotional response, he contradicts himself actually about her emotional response too, but even he agrees, contrary to what you've heard from the state again today, even he agrees that when Nancy Brophy got there, he immediately made a beeline for her. He says he held the tape up and he ushered her in. He was the first person to get to her. And that she said to him something to the effect of, "Oh, Brian, this doesn't look good." And he said, "It's not good, Nancy. It's not." Right off the bat. And then she walks over to Officer Wells, who starts crying with her and hugging her.
It's not good, Nancy, doesn't mean Dan's dead, does it? Again, that's not proof of anything. It's not good.
She's clearly singled out. She's standing isolated with Officer Wells away from everybody else. I mean, what could she possibly think had happened? Of course she knew. Of course she knew.
Again, she may have suspected very strongly. She may have felt it in her water. But people who are dealing with the death of the love of their life by sudden violence are not quick to believe it, regardless of the evidence. Right? They're not like immediately resigned to it and telling other people about it.
It could be that Nicole Barlow, when she heard her cry out, that she was hearing her immediate response to what Mr. Wilkie said. Now, I said that Mr. Wilkie contradicts himself on this point somewhat too. And that he came back in to tell you a second time that she didn't seem all that upset. But when he came in the first time, he told you that one of the other things he did that day to support Nancy Brophy, his good friend's wife, was that afterwards, the detectives were willing to let her drive herself home, and he intervened to say, "Oh, no, she's too upset. You drive her home, detective. I'm tasking you with driving her home." But that seems, whether or not the detective got there on his own, and you have to imagine he did, I think that that's the more credible account from Mr. Wilkie about his perception of how Nancy Brophy was doing that day. So circling back to Detective Merrill for a second and Oscar Taylor, keep in mind that not only are there these very large trays of what appeared to have been at least initially full, I don't know what you call them, but like fifths or liters of alcohol in pretty substantial quantity. But on top of that, there was testimony, I think, from Woody Bailey, and maybe also Tom Bethel, but Woody Bailey at least, about the fact that the restaurant that OCI was running did serve wine and beer. So that whole beautiful glassed-in restaurant space in the front where the students would learn how to serve and learn how to, actually function like they were in a restaurant, kind of the graduation after they got through the live fire exercise. That was a functioning bar. So there was all sorts of this Cabernet. As Detective Merrill corrected Ms. Maxfield when she asked about this note about Cabernet in a candle. He said Cabernet Sauvignon in a candle. That's what it was. That's something that was right there in that restaurant, right there at OCI, along with the candles. Mr. Bailey told you that the table service that they had the students put on did involve candles. So we know that morning at OCI, Dan Brophy disarms the alarm at 7:22:30. And then we know from Ellen Levine, who lives in that condo building next door, that she walks her dog, and she always goes, as I recall what she said, she always goes clockwise around the block. And it takes longer some days than others because she lets the dog kind of wander and do what he wants to do. But that she's captured on video, from Sergio Perez, that I think it was the Bellagio's video, picked her up walking as she reapproached her building to go back in with her dog. And she's on that video at 8:15 a.m. So presumably she walked by the big door, the big open bay door at OCI sometime around 8:12 a.m., give or take a minute. Could have been even later than that. But she had a clear recollection that that door was open that morning. It was unusual to her to see the door open that late on her walk with her dog. She didn't at the time know that anything had happened, but her attention was immediately drawn back to it after she went grocery shopping with a friend and tried to get back to her condo, only to find out that the road was blocked. Now, I'm going to digress for just a moment here to tell you that Ellen Levine and the other people who lived in those condo buildings were never interviewed by the detectives. They weren't contacted. We found her. We found her just by canvassing the neighborhood and brought her in with that relatively important piece of information. But the people who live or were residents of or staff, more importantly, the staff of the NARA Addiction Recovery Center that's right there in that same block as OCI weren't interviewed. And the people from that condo building weren't interviewed. There were other than the surveillance video that was gathered by detectives, they had a specific purpose in going to businesses to get surveillance video. There was very, very little canvassing of the area that was done in the course of.
Again, like, what motive do any of these people have to execute Dan? Right? I mean, I just don't see it.
This investigation. But we know from Ellen Levine that that bay door is still open at, let's say, 8:12. Dan Brophy gets to work and undoes decodes the alarm that's on the regular door that's at the end of that long hallway. And he does that at 7:22:30. And then he does a whole bunch of things.
Yep.
You can see that he's done a bunch of things. Not only is the light on the coffee pot on, but he has in his pocket, the medical examiner agreed that he had 17 $1 bills in one pocket, and then he had, I think, $60 in the other pocket. Well, the 17 $1 bills would have been from that little pig, the cart in the student lounge where he had students put in money for the saffron and the other wonderful things that he had out for them to buy in small quantities and small affordable quantities. And we know that he had done that it wasn't just that he randomly had 17 $1 bills in his pocket, but he had an IOU from a student in his pocket too. And so he'd taken the time to go maybe restock the cart, but he'd at least emptied the piggy bank and kind of checked out what was going on with it. He had gotten some of the stoves on. You can see that a number of things have been turned on. He was in the process of filling up the water part of the coffee pot. And in addition to that, you can see in the kitchen where his live fire event was going to occur that day, that there are a couple of big racks over in the corner of the room. And on those racks, there are some fresh products that wouldn't have been left out overnight. Some bags of rolls and some things that looked like the whole rack had been pulled out of that cooler in that big room over by the bay door. So we don't, of course, have a complete account of what Dan Brophy had done that morning before the intruder snuck in. But we do know, and I think Mr. Overstreet conceded as much in his description, that this all would have taken a few minutes, that some time had gone by after he disarmed the alarm before this intruder came in to shoot him. Now, the suggestion was that somehow that window of opportunity for a shooter closed right after they believe Nancy Brophy's van pulls out from the side of OCI and goes up Jefferson. And let me be clear about this when I say they say. We're not contesting that van does appear to be Nancy Brophy's van, and it does appear to be Nancy Brophy driving it. We can look at those pictures just like the rest of you, just like her mother-in-law, and recognize that it appears that she was there. But we do take issue with that, I think, absurd, cartoonish animation that they gave you that shows a red vehicle that's parked right in front of OCI right at the opportune time. We do not believe that they have shown you any evidence that would establish that her vehicle was coming out from 17th onto Jefferson, let alone that it ever stopped in that area. So that we do take issue with. But the window of opportunity, I think,
I mean, fine, go ahead, take issue with that, and then don't you can take issue with that, all you like. She was still driving around right there within 6 minutes of the murder. So, maybe one camera angle they got off. I'm not buying it. I mean, they do seem to have a long list of holes that they're trying to poke. I just don't think they're succeeding.
because of the timing of that animated thing and the timing of the video showing the Brophy van leaving on Jefferson, Mr. Overstreet seemed to be saying that that window could only have been another couple of minutes after Mr. Brophy had gotten to the point of starting the coffee and getting the ice water ready. And I believe if you go back and check your notes, you'll see that the testimony actually was that he disarms the alarm at 7:22:30, and then at about 7:33, there are people starting to congregate in the back parking lot. None of those people have gone inside the building, and it isn't until sometime between 7:33 and 7:35, and we don't have an exact time for it. There are a couple different ways you could look at it, but it seems to be somewhere in that window of 7:33 to 7:35 that his colleague, Chef Damon, gets off the bus. She can be seen walking down Jefferson and then would have gotten into the building. So that window of opportunity is wider, I think, than is being described to you.
Even still, though, right? She's trying to suggest that Dan had been in there longer than, he'd been in there a long time, and Nancy had plenty of, would have already, he had gotten all these things done already. And so she would have already been in there if she did what the police said or whatever. But I just don't think that's true, because she knew that he had stuff in his truck that he had to bring in and out that he had to bring in for that day. So he may have gone in and done things like starting the coffee and taking things out that needed to start warmed up. Like, he may have gone in and started those things before going back to his truck to bring in stuff, because he wanted to give them the extra 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever that it would take. So I just don't think, again, it's a nice effort, but I don't think it proves anything.
But the window of opportunity that would have existed then for this idea that somehow Nancy Brophy had stopped, she just happened to be right there and had stopped and had gotten out and gotten into the building, that window of opportunity would have been very, very narrow when you look at the number of things that he had already accomplished that morning. And it's actually hard to imagine that unless he was running, that he could have gotten from his truck inside and done all of the things that had been done in OCI in time for her to then be seen a block away driving away at 7:28. Because the time between where she's seen down the block driving away and the time of the alarm stamp is 4.5 minutes. But you have to take some time off of that too, because if they were right, it would have taken some time to get back into the car and for her to drive away. So look at those numbers carefully before you decide that she really had the opportunity to do that. There is no evidence that she was on 17th, let alone that she was parked in front of OCI, and the timing just does not add up the way you're told it does. So we do know that there were a number of other people there who were behaving suspiciously. You saw the videos. You saw the man who was walking at a fast clip following the other man, and he was walking directly toward that intersection right there. He was on the OCI side of the street. He was on the north side of Jefferson, walking toward 17th, very, very shortly before Dan Brophy would have arrived. You saw the other people who were behaving in kind of an odd way, pacing back and forth. One of them looked kind of like a lookout. But the person of most concern, and we don't have proof that he had a gun that day. It isn't our job to investigate. We had no opportunity to investigate these things the way the detectives did. But the person that you do need to pay attention to when they talk about Nancy Brophy was the only person who had the opportunity to do this, she's the only one there, that's simply not true. They went to great lengths to lead you to believe, and the detectives told you Oscar Taylor had left the area until challenged about that. But Sergio Perez, who'd spent a lot of time poring over that video, was able to piece together fragments of videos from different businesses to show that, oh no, he hadn't left the area at all. No. What happened was that exactly as Dan Brophy is driving down Madison, exactly at the same time that he cuts off of Jefferson back to Madison and he's come down to the back of OCI, exactly that time, Oscar Taylor has turned the corner from Jefferson onto 18th, and he's walking toward that intersection of 18th and Madison that Dan Brophy is about to drive through. And then, and this too came out very grudgingly. It took a lot of extra witnesses coming in to try to piece this together. But then it turns out that those students who are waiting to be let into OCI in the back of the school, that those students actually see a man who fits Oscar Taylor's description. He's right there at OCI. And he does have a record. He does have a record for reacting violently. The state can minimize it and say that a lot of those things are really his attempts to steal things and get away with it, and that they're not aware of a time that he ever used a weapon in doing that. We didn't go through a thorough examination of his record, so I guess we don't know all of that. But he has a history, even by the state's.
But you could have gone thoroughly through his record, right? And you chose not to, because by not doing that, then you could use it as reasonable doubt. So again, not buying it.
Own admission to you today of reacting violently, reacting badly when confronted about the fact that he's taking other people's property. So why didn't they find us?
And sorry, that's a really big leap to me from like theft under $200 or whatever to murder. That's a big leap. And if they really thought that was the case, then they could have brought in his record to show that he had been violent or something. I'm not buying that at all.
Oscar Taylor, he was known to them. They said they recognized him when they saw him a couple days later in Gresham or outer Northeast Portland.
Being known to police can mean many, many things. Like, I suspect that a lot of unhoused people are known to police just because they're on the streets and the police are patrolling the streets and have a tendency to have a particular attitude towards unhoused people.
Why didn't they go find him? Why didn't they find out if he had a gun that day? Why didn't they learn a little bit more about what was actually going on? Why didn't they survey more people in the neighborhood, figure out whether he had been more of a problem? So at that point in time, this was essentially an investigation that Detective Posey was heading, although Detective Merrill clearly has taken it over more recently. So it's really on his shoulders that the responsibility falls for failing to find out whether a suspect's DNA might have been present on those spent cartridge casings. Detective Posey is the one who gave the order to superglue both of the casings so that fingerprint analysis could be run. Now, you heard from criminalist Willard, who's since retired, that in her entire 30-year career at PPB, that superglue to try to get fingerprints thing had never worked once. Not a single time that she tried to do that had that been done successfully. So the state can say, well, the incidence, the success rate of getting usable DNA off of a spent cartridge is low, and we didn't think that was worth doing. But it's not as low as zero. You heard from Karen Lawless what the science is, and that science was already known in 2018. In fact, one of the other things that came out of Detective Merrill's notes that he was questioned about was whether he hadn't had a meeting with the two lead prosecutors here, shortly before Ms. Brophy was arrested, and whether they hadn't asked whether that DNA testing could be done on the casings to try to get some insight into what had happened, how Dan Brophy had been shot, and who had been involved in it. There were some other things that just were not diligently investigated that are of enough concern to mention. There was that book that was lying out on the bench seat of Dan Brophy's truck the morning he was killed. Detective Posey said that he took that photograph of the book and the other things that were sitting out on the truck seat. But apparently he wasn't curious about what that book might signify about Dan Brophy and his apparent interest in psilocybin or psychedelics, the subject of the book, an interest that even his son Nathaniel confirmed. He told you that the two of them went to some sort of seminar or presentation out of town, and that was a subject of great interest.
So what's the implication there? That what? I don't get it. She's just throwing shade on everybody, right? Like, because maybe he had heard a talk on psilocybin mushrooms? Right, Patty? Yeah, now he shot himself in the back? What the heck? She had one point, I thought. There was one point so far with they could have checked for DNA on the bullet casing or whatever. That's it so far.
You could tell from Mr. Wilkie's presentation the first time he was here that was a subject of some interest to him as well. Detective Posey also didn't follow up with Nancy Brophy, not even once, after that phone call on June 6th. It seemed that his goal in that call, maybe he had tandem goals, but one of his goals, at least in that call, seemed to be to try to trick her into thinking that her husband had been having an affair. But he was already thinking along the lines of trying to sow discord, as raw as those days must have been for her. It didn't work.
Sorry, are police supposed to handle her with kid gloves when they think that she has been involved in executing her husband? Is it like, oh, they're not supposed to offend her with suggestions that Dan might have been looking elsewhere outside the marriage? I don't think that that's really, again, like, if you watch police interrogations at all, whatever, like, they're not, there are times when they pretend to be your friend to get you on board, and we're all pals here. It worked great with Chris Watts, but when that stuff doesn't work, things sometimes get a little uglier. So what is she saying, that they shouldn't, that they should just have been nice to Nancy when they suspected her of murdering Dan? That's ridiculous.
She responded to that ploy with maturity and grace.
Oh
That was
yes,
the very last conversation he ever had with her until she was.
I have yet to see her behave with maturity and grace. So you'll have to explain to me what that might look like, because I certainly haven't seen it.
Arrested. He assumed that she was guilty because he saw on video that she was in the neighborhood near the time that her husband was killed. The possibility that she could have been an OCI was enough for him.
I mean, come on. She lies and says that she's home in bed, and then when she's caught out on video, she says, "Oh, I have retrograde or anterograde amnesia." Right? I mean, come on.
He assumed she was guilty because they owned a gun and a slide. The possibility that that could have been used was enough, even though that decidedly was not proven to you. And then his partner, Detective Merrill, who told you he was 100% positive her van turned that corner from OCI onto Jefferson. He had to look at the video 100 times to be sure, but in the end, he assured you he was positive. After looking at that video 100 times, he was 100% positive he could see her van turn onto Jefferson.
How dare he be thorough and make sure? My goodness.
In that solitary, very, very grainy video clip. He was so sure of that he directed Kelsey Guay, the technician, to create that animation. He created that. He had her create that so that you could see what he was imagining. You could see more clearly what he's so certain he could see in that video after watching it 100 times. That video is not evidence. I mean, that animated video, that whole montage that they put together for you is not evidence. It's Detective Merrill's imagination of what the video might show, if only everything had happened the way he imagined it happened. And keep in mind that even Kelsey Guay, who created that montage, agreed that seeing a glint of light in the video, what Detective Merrill takes to be the van, isn't the same thing as seeing the van itself. So she concurred there are plenty of other things that could cause a quick glint of light in the camera at that moment.
I mean, to be fair, yes, of course, Lori Vallow has had the pretty white lady thing working for her, and Nancy Brophy doesn't, but she was supposed to have the Mrs. Santa Claus thing working for her. So
Detective Merrill also is the person, circling back to Oscar Taylor and the conversation about these other men who were approaching all of them, last seen walking in the direction of OCI in that open bay door. Detective Merrill also told you, and told Ms. Maxfield in response to questioning, that the people who were living without housing in downtown Portland, the population that had spilled over into Goose Hollow by that time and was fairly well established by 2018, that entire, just generalizing for the whole population, he said, no, they only fight with hands and feet and fists. The gun violence is rare. He suggested that it was almost non-existent.
what?
So let's talk a little bit more about the gun evidence that was presented to you. The zip-tied slide that's out of battery. We've heard a lot about that, as if somehow that dispositively proves that slide had been removed and replaced on the morning of June 2nd. There's nothing about the way that slide is seated that tells you anything about what was done, or the way that slide is seated on that gun that tells you anything about how that was used or handled or manipulated, or when it was last used or handled or manipulated. That proves nothing.
I mean, okay, she has a point. The fact that the slide was not seated properly doesn't prove that Nancy killed Dan. The fact that it's not seated lends credence to the argument that is, based on all the other quite solid evidence. So
The slide was removed from the receiver. The receiver is that lower part of the gun. It was removed from the receiver at the gun show. Brett Glendenning and his colleagues showed Ms. Brophy. He told you and she told you that they showed her how to properly maintain and clean the gun. He also told you, importantly, that having that zip tie in there will cause it to misseat. And if I understood him correctly, if you put the zip tie in after it's already in the proper position, you can get the zip tie in. But if you've got a zip...
Sorry, I don't really think that she should be up there saying, if I understood him correctly. I feel like she should be claiming some authority about what she's saying here, not... She's not me over here on YouTube speculating. Good heavens.
Zip tie in it, and then you try to put it back on, it will misseat. It'll misseat every time. The zip tie is enough to keep it from sitting where it should sit. Now, he and one of the detectives, I think, mentioned that typically it'll misseat backwards, the way Mr. Overstreet was showing it to you this morning, that it, you won't be able to get it completely flush in the back, and the slide will be back a little bit rather than forward. But obviously it can misseat forward too, or it wouldn't have been in that condition when the detectives found it. But it doesn't tell you that she had changed the slide or done what they think she did that morning. It just means that the slide had been removed some point. It had a zip tie in it, and it didn't get back on the gun right. That could have happened. How many days were there in between? For at least 100 different days that could have happened. And what Ms. Brophy told you from the beginning is when they got that gun home, she got it home from the gun show. She and Dan Brophy looked at it that evening, and they were, kind of not sure exactly what to do with it, and had some conversations about what next steps they should take and what the right thing to do was. And she got as far as trying to do what Mr. Glendenning had showed her, part of it, and then was just sort of like, this is going to have to wait for people who understand this better to walk us through this, because this is just, it's not, kind of over my head. It's not my thing. Nothing.
I don't mean to interrupt. Is this a convenient time to take a pause, or would you prefer a few more minutes and then we take a pause?
Actually, this will work.
Okay. All right. Let's take our afternoon break now and be back on the record at 4.
Yeah, so I don't actually believe that it's that difficult. I mean, you would have to take Nancy's word for it that it was like, you don't believe them when they say it's easy. It's not that easy. I broke 2 fingernails. Like, I mean, you just have to take her word for it that that's true if you were going to follow this lady's line of reasoning here, and I do not. Now what happens? 131. Oh, I gotta go to 152. Hang on. Oh, I'm confused. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Okay, 210. Yes, that makes more sense. I did write all these things down so I wouldn't have to faff around, but here I am faffing around anyway. Anyway, so I mean, she's making a good effort at poking holes in things, but I don't think she's succeeding in poking holes in things so far. I mean, if I was on the jury, and I mean, clearly she was convicted, but if I was on the jury, I would be thinking all the things that I'm thinking now, which are, yeah, I'm not buying it. There we go.
How's that? Better? Okay. All right. I'd earlier lost track of a couple of slides, and I knew I did it, but now I found them. So let me go back to talking about that window of opportunity. And I think I should correct myself. It appears it's 5 minutes and 30 seconds, not 4 minutes and 30 seconds. But in that time, Dan Brophy had to make 2 separate trips out to his truck, out to the corner of Southwest 17th where he was parked, to unload the carts. And there are carts that you can see in Exhibit 216 there that have the pig in them. But it's unlikely, given the size of those carts, that he could roll 2 of them at the same time. But there are 2 that are present in those photos that you'll see. He had to empty that little piggy bank that you can see in this one, and there's a better photo of it later, but he had to get the money out of that pig, including this IOU that you can see here. This is one of the things that was in his pocket that the medical examiner found. There are the $1 bills. He had to go back into that large, deep storage room, get into the cooler, and then roll out that big rack that has the perishable ingredients on it. And that you can see in the corner of this kitchen, and this is the kitchen that his class was going to be working in for live fire that day. And then the ventilation, the lights, and then start the process of getting the coffee and the water going. So clearly that's something that would take several minutes, and may well have taken that entire 5 minutes and 30 seconds.
Okay, so again, maybe this is a good attempt at poking holes in the she couldn't he couldn't possibly have gotten all that done, and then Nancy had time to get in and kill him before she could then be seen driving away. But if you think about the timer that the prosecution put on the Corey Richens 911 call, where they're trying to get her to do CPR, and it was 5 minutes and 56 seconds before she pretended to finally start. It was a long time. Like 5 minutes sounds like a really short time, but I mean, if it only took 30 seconds for him to do each of those things, that only adds up to 3 minutes, right? You know what I mean? Like, so I'm just saying, this whole the unlikely possibility thing, like if they really wanted to poke an actual hole in this, they could do some actual calculations that might make it seem a little bit less than just a supposition.
And remember, it's not a full 5 minutes and 30 seconds because that timestamp is when the van is seen a block away driving west on Jefferson. So now let me go back to where I was. All right, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the CSLI records. Next. So you heard from Delilah Marvell and from Nancy Brophy that there was a party out at their place at the Marvells at their woodland acreage in the summer of 2016. And that after that, Nancy and Dan Brophy realized that that area around Gales Creek, which is the general vicinity in which they have their land, out toward Vernonia, that entire part of the county just inside the coastal range would have everything that they desired. They had great access to Highway 26, which, as you all know, in the winter is a pretty reliable highway. It's wide and it's relatively safe, certainly much safer than some of the other highways that you can take coming back into Portland from the west. The coast is only about 40 minutes beyond that. It's flat, rich farmland until you get up into the coastal range. There's just some beautiful farmland out there with the Nehalem River running through it. You can get land at a good price. It's still a relatively inexpensive part of the city or of the state, especially given its proximity to Portland. It's definitely less expensive than getting into Yamhill County and Pinot Country or getting too close to Hillsborough. It was a place that they could afford, a place that was close enough for them to stay connected to family and friends. Now, Nancy Brophy can't now tell you which days she went out there or where exactly she went. She can just tell you that after they went out to that party and she saw Dan light up, saw how much did he tell Delilah Marvell, you're living the life, that he was so happy that she thought, okay, this is the ticket. This is probably what we should really hone in on. And so she would explore. She'd just drive around, and she loved to get lost in her thoughts. And there are plenty of small roads that etch that area before you get into the Tillamook State Forest. The fact that that public shooting range is in the Tillamook Forest does not tell you whether the tower that Ms. Gway and Mr. Roloff were testifying about is in the Tillamook Forest. The tower, as you can see, is quite some ways before. And you can tell that even though the elevation is starting to pick up there is absolutely no reason to believe, and I suggest to you that it's not true, that the tower itself is in the Tillamook State Forest just because the shooting range is. Ms. Brophy can't tell you for sure when she went to Vernonia, and she can't even tell you for sure that's what she was doing March 26th and 27th, because she doesn't know. She has not focused. She had no reason to focus on those days until just very, very recently. But her explanation for why she might have been meandering in that area makes a lot of sense. That would have been a wonderful, wonderful place for them to live. Ms. Gway also told you when she was here this last time.
Sorry, I feel like all of that overlooks the fact that we have evidence that that's not what Nancy wanted, right? Nancy didn't want that life. She wanted the life of an expat over in Portugal, and she wanted trips, and she wanted a certain kind of lifestyle that they couldn't afford. So, I mean, all that, whatever, I mean, she's arguing, I guess she's sort of testifying about the price of real estate. She didn't show any evidence except her own word. It's a red herring because we already have evidence that that's not what Nancy wanted, right? That was the life that Dan wanted, and it was the life that Nancy signed up for, but she at some point changed her mind and wanted a different life. So again, I don't feel like any of this is, I mean, it's not landing with me, so.
That she made no attempt to ascertain how many times Nancy Brophy drove through those small towns outside of Vernonia. She was asked to focus specifically on the towers that were in Vernonia that would show that she got basically either into Vernonia or just short of it, but that she didn't look at all the many other towers that dot that area to find out whether Ms. Brophy had been driving around looking at properties and just sort of brainstorming about places that would work. in those months. But she did tell you that what she looked at were records that only went from November of 2017 through June of 2018. And the Marvell's party had been a full, almost a year and a half earlier in the summer of 2016. So there was a lot of territory there to cover, and there was a lot of time to cover, many, many months that were just outside of the analysis that she was able to testify to you about. And in fact, she told you that she had at one point been asked to look to see what towers were closer to one of those other locations. I think maybe it was a Gales Creek location. I don't remember exactly what it was. She'd been asked to figure out whether there was a tower she could search or she could check against the records, but then there was no follow through, and she was never asked to actually look at it. So you have very, very little information to support this contention that Ms. Brophy wasn't driving in that area doing exactly what she told you she was doing. And in fact, it makes more sense that she was doing exactly that. Because what Detective Merrill hypothesized, and even today, Mr. Overstreet said, as he was talking about this CSLI demonstration, that this idea that on March 27th, Ms. Brophy had gotten all the way out to that gun range and somehow learned to fire a gun. So even his own admission, his sort of self-deprecating comment was, we got a little crazy with it. Detective Merrill and I got a little crazy with that. But then he doubled down and said, he still thinks that's what happened, as crazy as that description was. It was cartoonishly crazy.
It's not cartoonishly crazy. I don't know if any of you have ever fired guns or whatever, but I have fired guns at a shooting range. I had a boyfriend for a while, whose dad was, ex-military, and he had a lot of guns, and he was very involved with his local shooting range and all that. And he was very, very safe and very, very rule conscious and all of that stuff. But if you were not, or if you were going to this, what sounds like this side of the road shooting range, I mean, it takes like 2 seconds to shoot it. Not even. Right? You can shoot 6 rounds in literally 10 seconds. So the idea that it's cartoonish is, again, not buying it.
Was ridiculous. That his hypothesis is that because that's the one time they can find Nancy Brophy's cell phone anywhere in the vicinity of that range, that what must have happened that day is that she raced from her home in Beaverton in her Toyota Sienna. She gets all the way out to North Fork Wolf Creek Public Range. She gets to the turnoff from Highway 26. She passes that tower, the one in question, and then she turns off Highway 26. So she has to get from the tower to the turnoff on 26, and then she has to drive down North Fork Wolf Creek Road, which you can see up there. 26 is the one that comes down at an angle across the lower right of the screen. And then as Mr. Roloff described, Mr. Stringer described to you, the intersection is actually back a little bit. But she had to get that far down the highway before she turned off on this obviously small and gravel road that snakes through the woodlands there up in the mountains. He had to drive all the way down that winding road to get to the public range. And Mr. Stringer told you that when he did that recently, even to get to the very first of those 4 ranges took him about 6 minutes. So let's say it's 5 minutes down 26 and then 6 minutes up to that range. What I believe Kelsey Gway and Josiah Roloff agreed on is that the CSLI data suggests that that time that she was past that tower, that she got into that vector that was pointing, generally toward the range, or covered that space that included the range, that would have been 25 minutes, approximately 25 minutes. So if you assume, then that's a round trip, right? She's got to go 5 miles or, 5 minutes down 26 and 6 minutes up into the woods. And then she's got to double that back. That's 22 minutes right there of drive time. That gives her like 3 minutes to find the range, figure out what to do, get out of the car. If there's somebody else shooting, to tell them, please, would you mind stop shooting? Because I'd like to go put up a target for myself. I have to run down the range and I don't want you to shoot me while I'm doing that. And then she figures out how to get the clips into the gun and fires off all these shots. And presumably, because she actually wants to know now, indulge me because I know this does sound crazy, but she wants to know whether she's learned to shoot well enough that she can stop practicing. She's got this nailed. She runs down to check the target again, and then she runs back to her car and shoots back down the road. And before long, she's in Northeast Portland having coffee or lunch with a friend.
Okay, you don't really need to practice shooting like a lot, like target shooting, to walk up behind someone and shoot them in the back. So again, not buying it. And literally, to my mind, all she needed to do was to fire that gun a couple of times just to make sure that she knew what was going to be the kickback. That's it. She didn't even have to go to the gun range. All she had to do was go near the gun range so that the sound of guns, bullets being shot or fired or whatever would not be wouldn't alarm anybody. So again, it's a nice try, but I'm not buying it.
It's absurd to think that she's done all this planning, she's done all this preparation, and that's what she does to learn how to shoot. It's absurd. Maybe as a matter of physics that's possible, but as a matter of common sense, it's not. It makes much more sense that she was exploring the area, that she hoped to inhabit before too long. So besides the fact that the evidence relating to the gun is just horribly insufficient to support a conviction, you've got no evidence that she could have accomplished the shots that killed her husband with that kind of incredible precision. I mean, remember what the medical examiner told you about that. Severed his spine, his aorta, his heart, a lung, and that's just one of the shots. And then the other one manages to take a parallel track going back the other direction. Again, goes through his heart. I mean, just that's amazing precision. And there is no evidence that's presented to you that those were close range shots. They certainly were not. The medical examiner told you there was nothing in terms of damage to the skin or to the body that indicated that those were, such literally point blank shots, that sort of precision would be, perhaps imaginable.
Again, how close do you think you have to be to shoot someone in the back? I mean, you don't have to be a precision if you walk up behind somebody and shoot them in the back. And then if you turn them over, I mean, you could hold a gun a foot away from somebody's heart and hit them. That is, I mean, again, not buying it. None of this is evidence, and it's not even a good argument.
No, those shots were taken by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. And they didn't learn how to do it by racing up to the North Fork Wolf Creek Range and firing shots off in 3 minutes on a cold spring morning and then hopping back into the car. So besides that insufficient evidence, really,
I feel like that's very reasonable. I can very much picture her doing that. She's not going to go right to the gun range, right? Because she doesn't want to be recognized by anybody. She doesn't want to be seen. So she's going to go near the gun range. She's going to jump out of her car. She's going to fire that sucker off as many times as she, to get a little feel for what's the gun going to do in her hand. And then she's going to jump back in the car and hightail her ass on out of there. I can picture it in my mind.
Relating to guns and her ability to use a gun that capably, that incredibly capably. You heard all sorts of other conflicting accounts about her ability and her capability when it came to planning. Nancy Management Brophy is so organized that she planned a murder for months, and yet she forgot to drive to the scene incognito in a vehicle that wouldn't be recognized. No, she took the van that her in-laws had given her. She's so organized that she forgot to check for nearby cameras. Never occurred to her, with all the writing that she'd been doing in this sort of mystery suspense genre that she was in, romance writing, never occurred to her that there might be surveillance cameras, like maybe along the TriMet line that Jefferson follows right there. Nope. Didn't notice those cameras over on the PPB building across the street. Just didn't even occur to her that surveillance might have been a problem. So there she goes, driving a van that's clearly distinguishable. She's so organized, Nancy Management Brophy, that she overlooked how much safer and easier it might have been to accomplish this goal another way. Maybe while hunting in the woods, maybe on any number of other occasions. If you accept the state's hypothesis, totally unsupported by evidence again, that she actually was aware of the comp benefit, that somehow that would be helpful. Mushroom hunting in the woods is something you did for work sometimes. But no, she went to a place where she had been going regularly for years, that she even went for fun, for lunch with friends. A place where everybody knew her, where she was well recognized, driving a well-recognized van. And her deliberate planning went on for months and months, but she couldn't be bothered to wait the 5 more months it would have taken for that most valuable of the life insurance policies, that accidental death policy, to pass out of its contestability period.
I think that's true. I think she's not as smart as she thinks she is, Cappy. And I think that she thought that she would be able to get away with it. I just think that she thought she would just tell her story and everybody would believe her. Like, I mean, we see this all the time, right? This is not like, I mean, maybe juries, maybe the defense lawyer is aware of the fact that, individual members of the jury may not be well aware of the fact that we see this all the time. These type of people who think that they can just talk their way out of the murders they commit. This is common. So again, not buying it.
That would have happened in November of that year, but no, she just couldn't wait until November. Apparently now the suggestion is that that's somehow related to the fact that Dan was going to go back to teaching days, but certainly at some point he would have gone back to teaching weekends. But gosh, that was only $250,000. Why wait for that? She's motivated by insurance. She didn't care about the most valuable properties. And she knew that she could hide the purchase of the slide that she purchased on eBay, if she just went back to the gun show, these gun shows apparently are happening once a month or once every 2 months or with some frequency that kind of surprised me, but she could have easily gotten back to a gun show, paid cash for the slide, didn't have to register it because that's not an operable gun. That's not a piece that has to be registered. There's no background check. Could have just paid cash for that. But instead, she opted not just to purchase it on eBay, but out of the same joint account with her husband, endpoint account.
Again, it's the same argument as before that we've already debunked, because her whole defense is that it's no secret. It's no secret. I wasn't hiding anything. This is for writing, and this is for defense. So she's not like, this doesn't, again, she's trying. I know she's doing her best, but not buying it.
So there are a couple of other aspects of the CSLI that I think are just important to touch on briefly, but one is this idea that she had abandoned her husband's family. I understand where that came from, and I think that was said to you in complete sincerity. But I do want you, I'm not going to play them for you now. I'm not going to put them up because you're going to get the unredacted versions, not the ones that we were looking at in court where we were trying to disguise the phone numbers. But you'll have the versions that actually have all that data in them. But look at the frequency of those contacts. Look at the frequency of those visits back and forth. They were in good contact that summer. They talked more than once a day. And that was going on, even though she's spending all that time in Texas. She's got all these other things going on, and all the people in her family who are, wanting and needing attention to work out those details and deal with their own pain. But she still was every bit as connected to Karen and Jack Brophy as she ever had been. And she had good contact with Nathaniel as well. So.
Right. And she thought that she could fool them all into feeling sorry for her and coming to her aid and supporting her in her grief after Dan. I mean, yes, these kind of people use other people all the time. And also, they need supply, right? So, I mean, if Dan is gone, she's still going to need her supply, right? Why not get it from his family members? I am not being convinced.
A failure of memory, inadvertent, nothing to blame anybody for. It happens. It happens more and more as we age. So let's talk about memory. Of everything you heard about memory, and there was a lot being thrown at you, a lot of different conditions, a lot of different explanations, but the two that matter from our perspective, the only two that matter, are this concept of not attending that Dr. Riesberg talked with you about, and retrograde amnesia. We're not at all worried about anterograde amnesia, except the fact that I sometimes have trouble pronouncing it correctly, but that has nothing to do with this. That's the memory going forward from whatever the shocking event is, and we're not talking about that. We're talking about...
That was a Nancy level joke. The not being able to pronounce anterograde amnesia joke.
Retrograde amnesia, which means that a period of time immediately preceding the event gets wiped out, or at least partially wiped out. So retrograde amnesia and not attending are the two important concepts. And I'm going to ignore almost all of the rest of those, except that I just want to say clearly, disassociation and PTSD and the kinds of trauma therapies that Dr. Best was talking with you about that relate to PTSD, none of those are, to us, those are red herrings. Those are confusing the situation. And it's important to keep in mind that when the state criticizes the frequency with which these amnesia defenses come up, to understand that the vast majority of those are about like alcoholic blackouts or things that have nothing to do with this case. None of the blackout phenomenon, which of course does come up in a million different criminal cases for understandable reasons, disassociation, PTSD, none of those things have anything to do with what occurred here. What Dr. Riesberg was describing to you are those two concepts or two phenomena, two things that science has recognized do happen, of not attending and retrograde amnesia. Now, the two of them.
So just in case you guys don't know, this is actually some of the testimony that I did watch was their expert on memory. And he's like, he kept repeating it over and over and over again. He's a psychiatrist. He has a PhD. He's a doctor of psychiatry, but he is a research scientist. He does not see patients. So everything that he testified to was theoretical, and none of it had any, and he was not able to even testify on how any of it might bear on Nancy because he doesn't see patients, because he's a research scientist. So yeah, just saying.
Not attending is a fairly common thing. It really just means that you are concentrating so much on something that's important to you that you're trying to accomplish it, that you kind of, it's like you've got blinders on. You lose track of everything else around you. And unless something really draws your attention, pulls you out of your reverie or this, very high concentration state that you're in, you don't notice what's going on. And we all do that. I mean, to varying degrees, we all do that. In fact, that probably is what explains why Chef Damon didn't notice that morning that she was in the building with Dan Brophy for that long, long period of time. I just didn't pick up on the fact that they'd never exchanged pleasantries. She never crossed it in the hall. That you look at the layout of that building and you're going to run into other people if they're in the building with some frequency because there's that one central hallway that goes down. But, she didn't notice that. She even, when she found the door open at what must have been at least 8:12 or so in the morning, that big bay door, she thinks that's weird, but she doesn't think, well, I should find Dan and ask him why he didn't close it. And then she gets to the back door to let the students into the student lounge. And again, she's just kind of like, I wonder why he didn't let him in. Doesn't go to find him because she was concentrating. She had her own class to teach and she was really, really focused on it. And so she was not attending. She was not paying attention to all of these other details and the potential significance of them. And I'm sure she felt horribly about that afterwards, but it's not something she should feel badly about because we all do it. We all do it in varying degrees, and there are varying things that cause us to give something that much attention.
Why would she feel bad about it anyways? I mean, I know that people, you feel bad because of course Dan's dead and you didn't realize it, but I mean, most people can parse through the whole, there was nothing I could have done. How could I have known all that kind of stuff? So I don't know. Just again, I don't think that her speculating is very fruitful.
That we tune everything else out. But what Dr. Riesberg was explaining to you about that is if you're not paying attention, if you're not attending to other details, they're not getting into your mind. They're not getting into your memory. You may actually not have noticed all these things. And so it wouldn't be later that you could give a perfectly complete account of everything that had been happening around you while you were not attending.
Of course, I mean, the research is probably based on, they get their data sets from clinical practice. I would agree with that for sure. But I also, he kept saying himself, I can't testify to this. I am a research scientist. I can only tell you about the research, not about the individual person. And he never met Nancy. He never spoke to Nancy. He never did anything with Nancy. So just to say.
If your concentration is narrow enough and focused enough, you really have just lost all of that. You never took it in. And that's important in this context, understanding what probably was happening with Nancy Brophy that morning. So retrograde amnesia, which would have then occurred later, the not attending period would have been the time that she's thinking about this book, this trilogy. She's not gotten a great night's sleep. She's really been excited about this, but she's kind of been on overdrive excited about it now for almost a week. And then she goes down there and she's trying to work out some of these details so she can get this all onto paper and off to the agent who then is going to present it to the publisher. And she's just focused as all get out on that. And then this horrible thing happens. And it is life-changing. It is absolutely life-changing for her. It is probably the worst thing that will ever happen to her. It's the kind of shock that most people don't experience in a lifetime because most of us do have the opportunity to come to terms with the passing of a loved one. Very, very rarely does that happen in such a sudden and such a horrific way. So
I mean, we've all heard the tapes of her in the aftermath, right? She doesn't sound even remotely horrified. She's like, oh yeah, I kind of figured. She just sounds about as offhand and unbothered as you could possibly be.
The pieces of that, and let me go back to the not attending. Well, no, I'll come back to that in a minute. So the pieces of that are so important to understand are that there are three factors that were described to you by Dr. Warford and Dr. Riesberg. It has to be extremely sudden. It has to be wholly unexpected. And it has to be very consequential and uncontrollable, right? And I think Dr. Warford used a term like negative valence, and Dr. Riesberg may have said that as well. But what they're talking about is just that the negative quality of what you have just learned, what has just happened, is so high and it's so uncontrollable and it was so unforeseeable that it causes a level of distress, a level of reaction that is very, very rare. And thank God it's rare. I mean, can you imagine if that sort of thing happened on with any frequency at all?
He also, from what I remember from the testimony, they were saying that the way any of this kind of amnesia works, you can suffer a shock like that and have amnesia, but you could have amnesia for the things that led up to it. but like, it's not like you have amnesia for the several hours that led up to it, right? It would be for like maybe a half an hour or an hour, but she's claiming several hours of lack of memory.
But it takes that constellation of circumstances to cause retrograde amnesia. And when that happens, it's a failure of the brain to even capture and encode the memories of the events that occur shortly before that loss is recognized. It doesn't matter, of course, when it doesn't matter, for instance, in this case, when Dan Brophy was killed, that's not the operative time frame. The operative time frame is when she realizes that it's happened, right? So the brain, as both Dr. Riesberg and Dr. Werford explained, there's a biochemical process and there's a mechanism at work that causes this. And essentially, in very simplistic terms, and I'm not nearly as eloquent as Dr. Riesberg, I know, but in very simplistic terms, the brain's flooded with adrenaline. It is so horrific. And that's of course what gives us this flight or fight response, right? I mean, it's something that is released in a very, very emergent situation. And that adrenaline flood is so extreme that the body then responds to it by saying, whoa, this is, you need to calm down. This is chemically, this is really too much for the body. And so then cortisol washes over and takes over and tries to control the adrenaline. At least this is how I understood what he was explaining to you. And that combination of things so thoroughly permeates the brain that the brain doesn't actually retain and then encode those memories. And they described how there are a couple of different stages of memory and it can interrupt all of those, but there's a chance that it even interrupts before it gets into short-term memory. That it's not just a disruption that occurs between short-term and long-term memory, but that it can be very immediate. So what Dr. Riesberg was explaining in terms of the general phenomena is that if you take the overlay of somebody who was not being very attentive because they had this very high degree of concentration to begin with, and they hadn't taken in everything that was going on, Ms. Brophy testified that one of the things she does remember from that morning, and she thinks it was that morning, she thinks this is an accurate memory from that morning, but one of the things she does remember is that there was a man working on a white car or a white vehicle that was near her, and at first, she didn't even notice that he was there, but after a while she started thinking, something about him is making me uncomfortable, and so she moved. Dr. Riesberg explained that those kinds of things that can break through your concentration are the bits of memory, those kind of postcards, little pieces of memory that are most likely to come in because they were significant enough to break through the concentration. And that I would suggest to you is also consistent with that whole series of calls then that she has.
There's also no evidence of that at all. They didn't offer any evidence that that white van ever existed. It's just, we're just going on Nancy's word. So I don't think you can really take that as evidence because she has motive to lie.
Later when she gets home. And as she's gotten the dogs, we'll go back to that in a minute, but she gets home and she's working on her computer. And then she gets that first call from Maxine Borcherding. And then Mr. Hively explained to you the whole back and forth, the lengthy calls that she's having with her. It clearly has both of their attention because they're on the phone back and forth nonstop during that period. And then she has a call with Karen Brophy. They're both alarmed. My recollection is that second call with Karen Brophy, the actual connection with Karen Brophy happens at OCI, not immediately afterwards at the house. But these women are all really worried about Dan. They're very alarmed. And so she does remember that series of events too before she gets down to OCI.
No, Billie Jean, this person did not evaluate Nancy, and he repeatedly told the court, repeatedly reminded the court that he is a research scientist and he doesn't do clinical practice. He doesn't see patients. So he was not able to take any of what he was saying and say, and then I evaluated this person over here, and that's how this all fits with my evaluation. So yeah, it's very weird to me that they did that. I feel like that's a very strange move. So why wouldn't they get her evaluated then if they were so sure that this was all true, right? It seems very sketchy to me.
OCI, but it's only those really for lack of a better term, those alarming pieces of what happened that morning that jump out more clearly than everything else. Now, when Mr. Overstreet was talking with Ms. Brophy as she was testifying, he was trying to get her to give him more detail about what had happened. I think somehow thought maybe her memory could be refreshed and she would be able to fill in more of those blanks, or maybe he was just cynical and didn't believe that she was unable to fill them in. But as he pushed her and he pushed her and he pushed her, you'll notice that and this happened in particular on the second day she was testifying. But when he pushed her and pushed her and pushed her, she started to acquiesce to what he was suggesting. She didn't always acquiesce, but she got to the point of exhaustion, and you could tell that she wasn't able to give him answers. But if she didn't know the real answer, she would agree with what he was suggesting had happened.
I really don't think that I have ever seen or heard anything quite like that in a criminal case. She's literally saying that the prosecutor wore Nancy down with his questions, and she started to just acquiesce because she got so tired. I don't even quite know what to say about that. I mean, he definitely dismantled her, and I'm sure that she felt just awful at the end of that cross-examination. But I don't really think it's fair to say that. I'm shocked that she is saying this. I'm shocked that she's saying this.
That she would actually let him help her fill in some of those blanks with information that he was giving her. Now, she told you, remember, she's about to turn 72, that she's been getting up at 4:30 every morning that we've been here. So she's probably finding this experience even more taxing and even more exhausting physically than all of the rest of us are. But she gets up at 4:30 every morning and she comes here. And she is attentive. She does her very best. But that testimony took a day and a half, nonstop day and a half. And her mind did start to wander.
Okay, seriously, she's the victim of the testimony. My God, the balls.
As she went further into it. But one of the examples that I want you to focus on of whether what she was saying, everything that she was saying was a real memory, whether it was accurate or whether she was just trying to give answers to questions, trying to fill in information that she didn't really know, had to do with that same CSLI that we were just talking about out near the North Fork Wolf Creek Range. Mr. Overstreet asked her when he was questioning her to agree that she had watched a video that morning of March 26th. He asked her specifically about March 26th, whether she'd watched a video about how to load a Glock that very morning before she drove out there, suggesting that she wanted to learn how to load the Glock that morning, and then she was going to go out to the gun range and use that newly acquired knowledge. Now, when Officer Sparling had testified some time ago, he told you there was some evidence she had watched such a video that morning. He did admit on cross-examination that it appeared that it had not been lengthy at all. In fact, I think he even conceded on cross-examination, although this wasn't drawn out, as I recall, on direct, that it had probably been just a second or two. It was a very, very short amount of time. But that's in the State's Exhibit 82. Now, Mr.
So what if it was short? I mean, it doesn't still, she was looking up how to shoot a Glock or how to load a Glock on the same day that her phone was out by the shooting range. Just because she didn't watch a long video, but it doesn't change the fact that she Googled it. No, does it? I don't think so.
Mr. Roloff had come in just, I think, 5 days before Ms. Brophy testified, and he had talked with you. He had testified about that same thing, and he had put together for us our Exhibit 339, which was responsive to State's Exhibit 82. And he did a number of things. He went back and looked for the videos that are listed on State's 82, but that Officer Sparling said he had not retrieved. He hadn't tried to look at. And we played those for you because we thought a lot of them were much more innocuous in the viewing than the name might suggest. You know, that there was this kind of fear-mongering quality to telling you that she'd looked at the videos, but the one that she'd watched for the longest period of time was basically a historical video about Glocks. It had nothing to do with how you might use one to actually shoot it. So, Mr. Roloff.
Okay, seriously, do you need to watch a video to know how to shoot a gun? Anybody? Does you pick it up and you hold it and you put your finger on the trigger and you pull the trigger? And lesson over.
In the course of that testimony, also went through that that portion of State's Exhibit 82 where the suggestion had been made to you in the initial testimony that she had watched this video about how to load a Glock. Now, I agree with Mr. Overstreet that at some point that video must have been on the computer. At least there must have been some brief link to it. We don't know that. You don't have any evidence about that, whether it was actually watched in whole. But what Mr. Roloff had told you just days before Ms. Brophy testified is that it had literally, there'd been dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of bookmarks or things, activity on the computer that had all synchronized up all in a row. And it's at 10, 13, I don't remember exactly what it is. I think it's 10, 13, 35 seconds and 10, 13, 36 seconds. And on our exhibit 339, if you look at pages 3, 4, 5, and 6, you'll see on page 3 this video that he was asking Ms. Brophy about watching, about loading a Glock. You'll see that video, but you'll see that it's high up in the string of all this activity that happens within 1 second. So we all knew, except for Ms. Brophy, we all knew she hadn't actually watched that video on March 26th, that was something the computer did all on its own. And yet, when asked about it, when he asked her to agree that she'd watched the video, she was just like, yeah, I guess if you say so. She, in that acquiescence, that filling things.
Again, even if after all of whatever that was, we all go, yeah, maybe she didn't watch that video that day. It doesn't absolve her. She watched it someday. He was murdered with that very type of gun. The slide and barrel are missing. She was driving around right by the Oregon Culinary Institute at the time that he was murdered. She completely lost her memory about everything that she, like, I mean, they got nothing. This is, it's on the order of the Curry Richards things with the, yeah, you know, an innocent person upon finding that their loved one had died of a fentanyl overdose might fear that they would be, you know, a suspect, and so look up what could possibly happen to me. But that didn't negate any of the other mountain of evidence. So, you know, I just don't feel like they're doing a very good. I mean, what can they do? They're doing the best they can with what they got. She threw them somewhere. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and they can't.
He does memory. But it doesn't mean that the information that the person is giving you is accurate. It also doesn't mean that the information that the person is giving you is untrustworthy for some reason that has to do with lying, right? We all know that there's a big difference between purposefully telling a lie and doing the very best you can with the information available to you to replace a memory to come up with an answer to a question. That's a natural human tendency. That's how the brain works. We try to be helpful. We try to use information at our disposal to try to provide answers, and that's what Ms. Brophy does.
I mean, I do have to admit that she is human, as much as she tries to hide that. But again, that doesn't prove anything. This doesn't prove anything at all, right? I mean, that's what people do when their memory fails them or they don't have the memory. They fit things in. That doesn't mean that she's not lying at all. It doesn't, there's no proof at all that she's not lying.
As many of you will remember, Donald Rumsfeld once famously explained that there are the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. There are the known knowns. There are the things we know we know. We also know there are the known unknowns. That is to say, we know, I can't do a perfect Rumsfeld imitation, I'm sorry. That is to say, we know that there are some things we do not know, but there are also the unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. It is the latter category that tends to be so difficult. Now, he offered this in the cusp, as an explanation on the cusp of our invading Iraq in 2002, but I mention it in this context because it does offer a framework for thinking through. Which
was a disastrous freaking war that you never should have been involved in the first place. So, weird, sketchy reference there.
What you've learned about memory, what you know about memory from your own experiences. There is no question, and Dr. Riesberg told you this, but that an extremely sudden, a wholly unexpected, and a very consequential and uncontrollable loss can cause retrograde amnesia. And that's a failure of the brain to capture and encode memory of events that occurred shortly before the loss was recognized.
Jem, I don't know if there was bullet casings at the scene. I believe they had the bullet. There's either the bullet or the casing, and that's what she was complaining that they didn't test it for. Yeah, it must be, because they were saying that it wasn't tested for DNA, so there must have been casings.
The best a person can do is to try to fill in the blanks. There is no therapy for that. There is no chemical, there's no pharmaceutical therapy that can be used that can try to recreate those memories. The best a person can do is try to fill in the blanks. And I say this with great fondness, but Nancy Brophy is a person who will fill in the blanks. She's a chatterer. That's how her brain works. She is always, always, always filling in the blanks.
None of that proves that she's not lying or that she had interrograde amnesia. None of it.
She will fill that in with words. And you saw that on full display here in the courtroom. The more exhausted she became, the more words filled the space.
Is she trying to make Nancy's insufferable behavior seem endearing somehow? The endearing efforts of a beleaguered and grieving old lady? I mean, my God, please spare me.
So there were times that her responses were obviously speculative. She admitted to things, that inculpatory fact, that more accurately, that supposed inculpatory fact, because it wasn't an accurate fact, that she had watched this video, but it was demonstrably untrue. The only point at which she stopped accepting all those facts that were being handed to her really was when she was asked whether she went inside OCI. And then her response in substance was, I cannot imagine that, because I cannot imagine that I would have killed my husband.
This is really bad. Sorry. Okay.
That's just
I'll
unfathomable.
let it go.
One of our known knowns, or our known unknowns, is how the stress of living in jail has impacted her ability to recall and relate information in her memory banks. It's hard to tell how much she could have accessed 4 years ago, before the sudden loss of her husband, before she was thrown in jail. We also don't know where she is in the process that we're all going through, that none of us really recognize well, but that we all go through with the gradual decrease and diminishment of memory over time. She'll be
Batty McBatface, there's like a 12 minutes left, and it's sped up to 1.3, so it's about 9 minutes left, or give or take. My math isn't perfect, but there you go. So just saying, we're almost there.
72 this month. She's well into the age that even somebody with high acuity may be suffering or starting to experience some imperceptible decreases in memory. There's no question she's a person of high acuity. She obviously is. She's got great social talents. There's no doubt about that. But do those things make her infallible? Does that mean that she can withstand the rigors of what she's been going through for the last 4 years, certainly for the last couple of months? We do have some known knowns, though, about that morning, thanks to the digital forensic experts, both Arthur Hively and Josiah Roloff. We know that she turned on her laptop at 8:31 a.m. It promptly crashed and then rebooted. And then she was able to work on insurance business for a few moments. You'll see in the exhibits that you have back with you, the defense exhibits 370 and 372 are exhibits from Mr. Hively that show her working on that insurance business after 8:31 in the morning. And they show fairly consistent nonstop activity. And then she turns to her writing. She turns to that Witches trilogy that she'd been so fixated on for that week, and she was racing to finish. And in Defense Exhibit 373, he shows you the proof that that's what she's doing on her computer, that there's a Lexar thumb drive that's plugged in, and then that she's working on that for quite some time.
Yeah, all that shows me is that she is so ridiculously cold that after murdering her husband, she was able to go home and work on her book.
She's doing that all in response to the email from the agent that you saw from May 25th. That's Defense Exhibit 209. And you'll have an index to all the exhibits, so it should be pretty easy to find these things. But those all tie together, and they presented all of that evidence to you. And then,
Little Whiskers says, Jodi Arias' trial, I was yelling at my TV. I never knew I could have so much hang on, the wrong gun. I've lost you. Never knew I could have so much contempt for another. That trial was so amazing to watch. And what's his name got, what was her lawyer's name? It's just gone out of my head. He ended up getting like disbarred basically after that because of the way that he treated the defense witnesses. He just ripped every single one of them a new one. But my God, it was satisfying to watch him tear down these ridiculous witnesses that were trying to suggest that she had PTSD and that she was, she was the real victim. It was Jose Martinez. It was absolutely, is that right? It was absolutely a thing of joy to watch. I would be down with watching that one again.
Mr. Roloff and Mr. Hively both talked with you about the series of phone calls that we've now gone over between Maxine Borcherding and Nancy Brophy, and then Nancy Brophy and Karen Brophy, and then the call from the friend who wants to see whether they can have lunch. All of those things happen in very rapid succession right before she goes down to OCI to talk with the detectives. And so from that, we know now that even though the questioning to Heidi Hutchinson when she testified suggested that she must have been wrong about her timing and that the detectives who wrote it down as that she must have run into Nancy Brophy sometime after 9 o'clock, but that's what she said initially. She said, no, I have a clear memory of this. My daughter had sports practice that morning and we would have gotten home from that sometime around 7:45 or 7:50 that morning. And we saw Nancy not very long after that. It was right about the time we got home. She must have been right about that because Mr. Hively tells you that by 8:30, so 45 minutes later, less than 45 minutes later, she's already on her computer. She's already doing work. So she must have succeeded in finding the dogs and gotten them home during that time between 7:45 and 8:30 in the morning. And then that activity is just continuous. Mr. Hively and Mr. Roloff show you that the activity is continuous right up through that 9:54 call from Maxine Borcherding, and then the call, and then she barely has enough time to get herself ready to go down and have this, what she knew by then was likely to be a very painful, difficult interaction with everybody at OCI.
That's right.
So whether or not you're willing to accept the state's judgment, and it has been harsh judgment that's been heaped upon her about the financial choices that she and Dan Brophy made, pursuing their passions rather than acquiring as much money as they could and as early in their lives as they could, whether or not you think that you might react differently if you were to experience an event like this, that you would be sobbing in every event, at every turn, whether or not that judgment is something that you can relate to. I want you to think about your responsibility here as jurors in this case and the standard and the burden of proof and whether those have anything to do with the way that you have to go about making these decisions. So much of that is really just can't lose for winning, can't win for losing argument. No matter which way she turns, there's going to be a criticism, and it's going to be a harsh criticism.
Yeah, she's the victim. Poor Nancy is the victim. I mean, that argument that everyone grieves differently, to me, every time I hear it, my whole being screams bullshit. Like, fair enough, not everybody is as emotive as everybody else, but there are certain things that we expect to see from someone who is, instantly and shockingly and violently in a position where they have lost a loved one. This argument never works for me. And in fact, it always makes me think the opposite. Every time I hear it, it's just bullshit to me.
Anything and everything is considered evidence of possible guilt.
I mean, that's exactly why the prosecutor in the Corey Richins case juxtaposed Corey's response with Eric's sister Katie's response to his death. And there was no everybody grieves differently nonsense going on there. There was one person here is genuinely freaking out, and the other person is trying to pretend that they are.
But that isn't the legal standard. That's not the standard for you to apply. Is it possible she could have done this? The standard you have to hold the state to is beyond a reasonable doubt, that there's no other reasonable possibility that you could reach. And unless you find that they have met that very, very high standard, you cannot return a verdict in the state's favor. Throughout this trial, and certainly today in this courtroom, throughout the state's presentation, the questions and the arguments have all foundered on this idea about whether something was possible. And I understand in a circumstantial case that we tend to do that, just as even though you don't have to find motive, you want to understand motive. Those things go together in a sense. But it has to be significantly more than that, more than whether it's just possible, whether that story makes sense, whether that could hold together, maybe whether that could be true. That kind of thinking stands the standard on its head. If you think there's any reasonable possibility that Nancy Brophy is not guilty, any reasonable possibility, that's the phrase that you need to keep in mind. If there's any reasonable possibility that Nancy Brophy is not guilty, in other words, the possibility goes in her favor, not against her, you must give her the benefit of the doubt. You must return a verdict of not guilty. That's what the law requires. There is no standard for Nancy Brophy to meet. The rules are that the state, and the state alone, has the burden to convince you that events occurred as they contend they occurred. They can't just throw out possibilities and throw out theories and hope that you merely find them more plausible than any other theory. It isn't our job to prove a theory. It isn't our job to prove whether Oscar Taylor had a gun. Those burdens, all of those things fall to the state to prove.
This argument always falls flat for me too from defense lawyers. Like, it's not up to us to prove anything. It's like, well, I mean, maybe not legally, but I feel like the jury, is going to want to be convinced by something that you're saying.
Only if the state has convinced each of you firmly, beyond a reasonable doubt, that there's no other reasonable possibility, can you return a verdict in their favor. Nancy Brophy loved her husband. She loved that man. You could see that in her eyes every time she talked about him.
Yes.
Her eyes lit up. They absolutely twinkled when she was finally able to be out in a courtroom and talk about him.
Please. She was out there getting supply from everybody listening to her gabbling on and on and on when she's been locked up in jail for so long and people don't want to hear from her, I'm guessing. I don't know. Maybe she's like Donna. Kurt Nurmi, I can't recall exactly. I can picture him very clearly, and I have a memory of him acting badly. But I'd like to be reminded a little bit more about that. I remember seeing him afterwards and not recognizing him and not realizing until I saw his name that he was the same person because he had changed so much. Yeah, I think that's right. There you go. Duper's Delight. Exactly. She was up there loving telling her little story.
They sparkled. You heard a love story in this courtroom, in this trial. You heard about a love that blossomed each and every day they were together, right up to their very last day together.
I really think that that's a very risky statement for her to be making right now because it seems very clear to me that that's not the case. And she is mischaracterizing it so badly that it's just going to rub everybody in the jury up the wrong way.
That love grew and grew and grew, and they were looking so forward to spending the rest of their lives together.
Ugh.
Nancy Brophy chooses to be the strong person that she's always been. She's never been one to sob or display that kind of emotion in public. She thinks of herself as somebody who should be strong for others. She prides herself on that. She was raised to be that.
Yeah, remember her testimony about that she thinks crying is useless? It's a useless function. Remember that?
Both of her parents were lawyers. You can imagine what that was like. She chooses to remember Dan Brophy in the garden. She chooses to remember him puttering around in their master kitchen. She chooses to remember him, to imagine him, to think forward and create memories of him still being with her, sitting on the porch that they intended to share as they slowed down a little bit. We should all wish for that kind of strength.
God. Gross me out. Are you telling me that we should all wish to be like Nancy Brophy? Again, I just think that's a really risky thing to be saying to a jury who may already be put off by her. And to be telling them how they should feel about her personally I feel like that's a very risky move.
So I want to close in thanking you again for your patience, your very steady attention that you paid throughout this entire long trial. I know that there were days that were interesting and days that were less so, but all of you were here and focused and present every single day. And that's a remarkable tribute to each of you as individuals, but also really in a social sense. This is a remarkable experience that people can come together and sit and peacefully talk about difficult things and come to a resolution. This has been an important gift that you have given all of the rest of us, and we appreciate that very much. It's also an awesome responsibility to carry with you because our system has provided no safety net for what you do. You are held in such high regard, and rightfully so, that the appellate court won't ever second guess the decision that you make, the factual decisions that you make, because you're the ones who are here in the courtroom with the witnesses. You're the ones who actually see people. You hear them testify. You can watch what they do. You see the complexity of how these pieces fit together. And no appellate judges, no panel of judges reading the transcripts, reading the black and white on the page could ever really take in as much as you've been able to take in. So that means that there isn't a safety net for your decision. You will be the ones who make this decision. If there's a mistake that's been made by one of the professionals in the room, they'll take a look at that. They understand what the mistakes are and how they should respond to those. But the factual decision is yours and yours alone. So having listened to the evidence as carefully as you have, we hope and believe that the conclusion that you'll reach is that the overwhelming majority of the evidence that you have heard does not support the state's version of the facts. That speculative approach, that speculative theory about how the facts might fit together, that might have happened, isn't sufficient. and that instead the evidence that you've been presented calls very strongly for the verdict of not guilty. Thank you.
Whew.
All right, Mr. Overstreet, I'm thinking that rebuttal will be tomorrow morning unless you believe it's going to be very quick.
Yeah, it will be brief, Your Honor. However, stuff to take down and set up. So
Right.
I
Okay,
couldn't say we'd finish before 5.
sure. Well, I guess I'll ask, do you think realistically by 5:15 or 5?
No, he does not. They carry on the next day. So, yeah, I agree with you, Little Whiskers. I've never seen anybody act quite that way either. The flinging the arm over the back of the chair and like sitting there like this, like she was jawing with the prosecutor, was beyond. Yeah, I mean, they didn't have that much to work with. I feel like she could have jazzed it up a bit by wearing some colors, and just brightening up her own presentation a bit. I feel like that would have been a good move. So the let me look here. Let me look. I wrote it down. So it's about 40 minutes, the rebuttal. Do people want to listen to it now? Because I'm okay to do that if people want to do that. Because it's not going to be long enough for a whole other video. So yeah, all that stuff about Jodi Arias. I want to gossip all about that stuff too. That's super fascinating. I knew that he didn't have his license anymore, but I didn't realize that he had given it up. So that's interesting. So yeah, okay, let's just watch it. It's good, of course, right? It's the next one. So this is, yeah, it's like 15 seconds. Yeah, he's very good. And I feel like he's going to be able to rebut. I don't know. Did they make up? Did they make one point?
You can all breathe a sigh of relief. This is the last time you're going to hear from the lawyers. I promise. I don't want to take up too much time this morning. In fact, I'd hoped to do this last night, but it seemed a little constrained for time. But I do want to cover some areas. This is not the opportunity for me to go back and re-argue the entire case. That's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is responding to what defense said yesterday. And we feel the need to respond because defense, once again, has twisted words and made their own statements, and they even supplement the evidence at times. What I mean by that is when there's a hole, when there was no evidence on a particular matter, the defense attorneys would just say something to fill it. And as you've heard over and over again, I've urged you to be cautious when listening to defense counsel when it's not things that are based in evidence. I have a list of things I want to talk to you about as evidence of that. And this list is not exhaustive. We just simply don't have the time to go through all of it. But what defense was saying is that they're not really acknowledging that Nancy was turning off of 17th Avenue onto Jefferson. Apparently, they didn't listen to their own defendant's testimony. That's exactly what she said. She said it was me. That is me turning off of 17th onto Jefferson. But defense can never commit to that. Ms. Weinmiller said that that the Brophy's decided to live in Vernonia or in that area, and that their money would go a lot farther there, that real estate's a lot cheaper out there. Now, there may be some common sense to that, but you heard no evidence in this courtroom about what they were looking for and what price range and whether they could even afford it. In fact, what Ms. Weinmiller stood up here and said is they were going to get probably over $400,000. Of course, they could afford something in the Vernonia area. But the reality is the house sold for $565,000, even after the yard was cleaned up and the house was ready for sale. That's not $400,000 in profit. They were maybe looking at getting about $200,000 in profit. So just use your own common sense on what in the world they think they're going to buy with land for $200,000 and own it outright. But again, no evidence of what that would look like. She then stated that, well, Ms. Guay only looked at the tower in Vernonia, the one servicing Vernonia. That's simply not true. Ms. Guay testified and told you that she checked a few towers in the area that could potentially service the Vernonia area. Did she go wide out 20 miles? No, of course not. But I think she testified that within 10 miles, she checked those towers. And there was no activity other than the activity on Highway 26. So once again, defense doubles down on this idea that that's exactly what Nancy's out there doing, and there's actually no evidence of that. Defense was clearly confused about the dates of March 26 and 27. She gave a presentation yesterday about how we are asserting that Ms. Brophy went out there on the 26th, shot her gun, and then went to lunch. That's simply a false statement. That wasn't the evidence. That's not what I told you. The 26th is the day that she went to lunch. That's also the day that I said she didn't have enough time to shoot. She went out there, probably doing recon like Nancy always does, and then went to lunch. It was the next day that she had plenty of time to go out and shoot a gun. Plenty. Again, defense is up here saying, I think her words were amazing, amazing precision of a shooter. That this person who shot Dan Brophy had amazing, amazing precision. A couple things about that. There is evidence that this was very close range, despite defense saying there isn't. What's the evidence that this happened at close range? The trajectory of the bullet alone tells you it's at close range. The person who shot Dan Brophy wasn't standing at the door shooting across the room. We would have had a much different trajectory. The person was standing almost directly behind Dan Brophy. The bullet that went in his back went slightly to the left of the center of his back when it tried to exit his chest. So the person standing behind him had to be nearly directly behind him to accomplish that type of shot. Well, what was behind Dan Brophy? Those two big silver tables that you saw. So the shooter either had to be in front of those tables, very close to Dan, or in between the tables, just another maybe 2 feet farther away from him. That alone tells you that this happened at a very close range. And Ms. Jacobs told you that Ms. Brophy disclosed that whether she was admitting that she was the shooter or not, but Ms. Jacobs was saying that Ms. Brophy was indicating that it was an arm's length away. Now, what does this mean? Well, defense goes back to this idea that it's such a precision shot. How could somebody without hardly any gun experience do this? Well, first of all, we don't know that that's the first time Nancy shot her gun. That's the evidence that I have that Nancy shot her gun, because we're relying on real evidence in this courtroom, not speculation. But nonetheless, what it does show you is that Nancy had the opportunity to be very close to Dan and shoot him. And again, even if he knew she was there, he wouldn't be startled. This is somebody he loves, somebody he trusted, would turn his back to continue his work. Once again, a reason why it's so unlikely that this could be somebody else. Somebody gets that close and Dan doesn't know. Dan probably knew that Nancy was there. Even though defense again asserts over and over and over that we claim that he didn't know about a lot of things. It's not true. And think about it. If we're talking an arm's length distance, and this is where Dan Brophy's standing, and I'm assuming I have a bigger wingspan than Miss Brophy, but let's use mine anyway. We're here. I'm shooting, and it's so unbelievable that I would hit my target. This isn't the world's luckiest shot, as defense would have you believe. This was calculated. Now, did she intend to sever his spine? Intend it to go through his heart or lungs or anything? I don't know. But she squared up and shot him straight through the back. And the second shot, there's no precision at all. When Dan's laying on his back, paralyzed, she just walks over to him right through his chest. What kind of precision is that? Anybody could make that shot. Defense then doesn't stop there with their statements and assertions.
Okay, that's what I said, just saying.
They go on and say that somebody claimed that Nancy Brophy abandoned the Brophy family. I don't know where you heard that. Nobody said that. In fact, I would argue, of course, she didn't abandon the Brophy family. That would seem awfully suspicious. You're the grieving widow and you just disappear. You don't talk to the family anymore. Of course, she continued to talk to the family. But defense claimed that she didn't, or that there was a claim that she didn't. The defense attorney also claims that Dan and Nancy were that Dan and Nancy were secretly planning a divorce. Don't know where you heard that. That wasn't in evidence. I never said that. I don't believe Dan and Nancy were secretly planning a divorce. Dan certainly wasn't. Dan had no intentions of leaving this marriage. No evidence that he had any intention of leaving this marriage. Nancy, on the other hand, wasn't planning a divorce either, but instead planning the murder. That's her way out. There are no plans for divorce. But yet defense attorneys, they continue to stand up here and say, that's what the state's asserting to you, and it's just false. Defense also asserts that the state claimed that Dan would force his wife to work so that he could have this precious yard in his garden. You didn't hear that either. I didn't say that.
Boss lady's saying, look at the difference between this counselor and the defense light years. Like, yeah, I had to come back. When I went to go feed the dog, I had to come back and slow it down a bit because he is so much more, my brain and words. Anyway, he's got so much more about him and he's got so much more going on. I can't believe words. Sorry.
There was no evidence of that. In fact, I would argue the opposite. I don't think Dan would do that. I don't think there's any evidence to support that. But defense doesn't stop there. They assert that we proposed that Dan didn't even know about the storage unit. I never said that. No witness ever said that. All you heard was that Nancy rented the storage unit. That does not mean Dan did not know about it. Defense then asserts that we claimed that Dan didn't know about the yard cleanup. That's ridiculous. Of course he knew about it. He has eyes. He lives there. He can see that there's yard cleanup being done. He may even had his hand in it. Where we disagree with defense on this is not that he didn't know about it, but what the purpose was for. Because the story now is we're cleaning it up so we can subdivide it. And now you know the subdivision story is garbage and not true. So Dan clearly wasn't thinking that. But even the sale of the house being imminent. I don't know that Dan knew that. I don't think there's any evidence that supports that Dan was really on board with this plan that they're selling the house now. Because look at the house and look at the physical evidence that you have.
I would also add that it seems very clear how much he cares, right? And I didn't get that from the defense. We got a couple of smarmy smiles that were akin to Nancy's smarmy smiles, but I didn't get passion from the defense. And this guy is like, yeah.
It was described to you. Nobody was starting to get that house ready for sale. Nobody. All they did was a little bit of yard work. Because remember, most of that yard work happened after Dan died. But look at the rest of the house and look how much help had to be brought in and how long it took to get that house ready that summer. They spent 3 months with all that help. That's what it took to get that ready for sale. So at the pace that Dan and Nancy were going, they were not heading for a sale of that house. Ms. Weinmiller stood up here and said that Dan must have signed for the slide and barrel that was delivered on February 28th. They said that. They actually said in their opening that they would prove that to you. And then she stood up here yesterday and said that Dan had to have signed for it because Nancy wasn't home that day. And again, what is defense doing here? Completely ignoring what the actual evidence was. Patrick Cowan, the gentleman who sold the slide and barrel on eBay to Ms. Brophy, sat right there and said, no signature was required. The Postal Service could have actually just put it in their post box. So why would defense stand up here and say, nope, signature was required? Dan must have known about it. Other than just to mislead you and confuse you. Ms. Weinmiller went on then to tell you that Nick White also thought that the blackberries needed to be cut. First of all, he never talked to the Brophies, so I don't know how he would know that the blackberries would need to be cut. And what he did say is if I did encounter blackberries on the property, I would have cut them myself to gain access. No need to go spend $21,000 to James Denny to clear these blackberry bushes to start the plan for subdividing. Ms. Weinmiller also told you that Nancy didn't sleep the night before the murder because she was working on her story. Nancy testified that she stayed up later than Dan and that was normal. She didn't tell you that she was writing, but it has to fit the narrative. Everything the defense counsel gets up here and says has to fit their narrative. And what Ms. Brophy actually told the detectives too about that night was that she couldn't sleep and because she didn't know why. So you heard 3 different versions of events. Ms. Weinmiller then told you that Dan would have had to bring in those 2 carts and she showed you pictures. He would have had to bring in those 2 carts that morning. That would have taken more time. Problem that is Ms. Weinmiller apparently didn't listen to Ms. Brophy's testimony when Ms. Brophy said that Dan brought the carts down the day before. On top of the misleading statements that Ms. Weinmiller and Ms. Maxfield have made during this trial, they fed you several red herrings. Now, defense counsel mentioned red herrings yesterday. I'm not sure that everybody knows the definition of a red herring, so I just want to cover that. The Oxford Dictionary defines the red herring as something that is intended to be misleading or distracting. That's what defense counsel is trying to do here. They don't actually have evidence to counter the state's evidence. So they just throw out a bunch of stuff to distract you and are asking you not to look at the evidence. Look at this other thing. So what are the red herrings that they sent to distract you with? Again, non-exhaustive list, just a few examples. Talked about suspicious people in the area. What relevance does that have? Because they want you to believe without any evidence whatsoever that, well, it must have been them because they're suspicious. And what's suspicious about them? They're walking. They also say that there's a person who appears to be a lookout. I don't know if you remember the video, but I believe the person that they're talking about is a guy who's kind of standing near a wall nearby, about a block away. But if he's a lookout, this is after the murder. This is after the police arrived. What's he a lookout for? It's a red herring. Even the term lookout is a red herring. Ms. Weinmiller stood up here and talked about a book of mushrooms that Dan owned. What does that mean? Nothing. She talked about a red bag missing from the Culinary Institute. But we don't actually know that because Nancy, if you listen to her, doesn't actually know if Dan brought a red bag that morning or not. She wouldn't know either way. The only time you heard about a red bag is from Nancy Brophy during the death notification, that she thought that Dan should have a red bag with him. That's it. Not what's in it, anything of value, nothing else. It's designed to distract you, maybe to suggest that this was a robbery. This person stole Dan's red bag. Not his money, not his wallet, not his phone, not his keys, not his car. Some random red bag. But you heard nothing else about that. Nothing. They also talked about general homelessness in the area. And they tried very hard, if you recall, with every witness who had experience in that area to get them to say that homeless people were scary in that area. But yet, one after one, each person came in here and told you, they're there. It's not that bad. Never been assaulted. Never heard of anybody being assaulted down there. In fact, you did hear from two gentlemen that defense counsel brought in here, and that was Fred Hartbett and Francisco Jaramillo, who worked at the BMW across the street. What they told you is, yeah, there's homeless people in the area. And we were there that morning coming in and out, and we saw.
I am just going to Apples is saying hello back. Hello, everybody. Okay, good job.
Saw nothing out of the ordinary. Not suspicious people, not anything concerning these two guys who are very familiar with that area. Sounds like they've worked down there for decades. But defense wants you to believe that there was a homeless problem when witness after witness basically said there wasn't. And then finally, how many times did you hear about a waffle iron and saw pictures of a waffle iron? Did you ever make sense of that? Why were they showing you pictures of a waffle iron? Why did they ask so many questions about a waffle iron? This is a prime example of a red herring. Get you thinking about a waffle iron. What does it mean? Was it there? Was it not there? Who knows? There was pictures of a waffle iron at the crime scene. It seemed to be fully intact and just sitting there where people said that it always was. What does it mean? They're just trying to distract you. So defense goes on to explain the finances. I am not going to spend more than a minute talking about this because clearly they were in financial trouble. I don't know who they paid to come in here to tell them that their finances were perfectly sound, but that is ridiculous. Their finances were awful. Ms. Weinmiller claimed that Mr. Rubinson said that Dan was worth more to Nancy alive than dead. Even after I just gave the closing argument and showed you how that's not true. She still stood up here and said, no, he's worth more alive.
She did.
But Mr. Rubinson said $1.13 million over the course of 17 years. Dan dead now is $1.6 million now. Well, $1.2 million now and another $400,000 paid out over time. I don't know what trial the defense team was watching, but those numbers don't work. Dan was not worth more to Nancy monetarily. Then Ms. Weinmiller goes, well, how do we even know Ms. Brophy knew about the workers' comp, that $400,000 that she'd get over time? How do we know she even knew about it? She owned a business. She better know about workers' comp. She ran a catering company, had 25 employees. She better know about workers' comp and how it works. But again, it's not about the money. It's the lifestyle that Nancy desired, partially driven by the amount of money she would get, but she needed a different lifestyle, as we've said, that Dan could not give her. But then defense points out, well, why would Nancy make all these purchases with her on-point account? A joint account. Clearly, Dan would have access to that. Clearly, Dan would know about these purchases and have questions. Well, first of all, who cares if he knew? Nancy would just say, oh, it's for writing, Dan. And Dan being Dan would probably like, whatever, and move on. So who cares if he knew? But I'm going to argue to you, Dan had no idea what was going on in that bank account. Dan didn't even really know what was going on in his own bank account. I'm going to show you what's marked as States Exhibit 86. This is a long record, so you have to go down to page 530. And what you'll see there is that Dan Brophy hasn't had a debit card to this account since 2016.
Oh, God.
So we know he's not spending out of this account using his debit card because he doesn't have one. You also can think back to the pictures that you saw of Dan's wallet contents. There is not an on-point debit card in there. You can also listen to what Nancy Brophy told detectives that morning when she rattled off what should be in his wallet. And she does not mention an on-point debit card. And it's because he doesn't have one and does not use that account. How do we know he doesn't use that account? Because he also doesn't write checks out of it. There's no checks written from Dan out of the on-point account. There is also no deposits from Dan's employment going into that account. This is a joint account, sure. Could Dan use it? Yeah, he has a legal right to it. But for all intents and purposes, Nancy used that account, and Dan had no idea what was going on in it. Now you can look to Dan's.
Right? That's really a good point. And of course, I didn't know that, but that's really underhanded of the defense to do that, right? To pretend like this is a saying, oh, it's their joint account as though it's their regular use joint account. People were commenting on the underhanded behavior of the defense, and I thought it was a bad defense, but I didn't realize that it was so underhanded because I haven't watched the whole trial. So, just saying.
Actual account, the Wells Fargo account, where his money is being deposited, where he does make expenses from. And I would argue to you, he doesn't even really know what's going on in that account.
You're welcome.
Why do we know that? Because he texts Nancy and says, hey, did my check hit my account yet? Nancy is management. She manages the funds. She manages the household. Dan checks in with her about the finances. And there's further proof of that in the Dearest Dan letter that you heard about. Clearly, this guy, Mr. Brophy, does not use online banking. And we know that because Nancy Brophy wrote to him how to access it. She had to instruct him on how to open the computer and get it started. He clearly wasn't doing any online banking. Mr. Brophy, as you've heard, as I've stated over and over, is a pretty simple guy, not one to use technology. And if he did, he would have to be instructed on it. Defense counsel then moves on and talks about the window of opportunity. She first said, well, it's only a 4.5-minute window on June 2nd for the murder to happen, but then she corrects it, says it's 5.5 minutes. But then she sort of questions the window altogether and kind of, well, Dan had to do so many things in there, and that would take too much time. And so, you know, the time that Nancy was there, she wouldn't have had enough time to kill him, I think is what they're asking you to, the implication to be. But the things they rattled off would maybe add up to a couple of minutes. Walking a cart from the cooler to the back, hitting the button on the coffee pot, maybe or maybe not gets the money out of the piggy bank, and then now he's back over filling up water when he's killed. That doesn't take very long. Nancy probably did wait for that, or she was there with him and he was undisturbed by her and she was waiting for an opportunity where he turned his back to her. But nonetheless, the argument is interesting from defense because they're suggesting that that window maybe was much more narrow, making it even more unlikely that this would be a random person.
Nice.
The breakdown of that morning is actually that the alarm was taken down at 7:22:30. You've heard that over and over. Ms. Weinmiller said, well, the next person gets there about 7:33, 7:35 or something. That is wrong. Miranda Bernhard got out of her Uber at 7:29. That's where that 6-minute window comes in. And if you think about 7:29 as opposed to 7:28 and some change, we're talking seconds after Nancy Brophy drove away from the Culinary Institute that Miranda Bernhard arrives. Remember how she arrives. She gets out of the Uber on the corner of 17th and Jefferson, and she walks right by that roll-up door. She's not reporting anything suspicious at that time. So at 7:29, it is reasonable to believe that Dan has already been shot and killed. So that window is 5.5, 6 minutes long. And think about this. Miranda Bernhard is also the same person that when she arrives, she walks around the corner and she sees the person that she thinks looks, or I'm sorry, that has the same characteristics as the person that's been identified as Oscar Taylor. Across the street, up the street a little bit, up Madison, up by the admin building, where all those cans are. So if defense is asserting that Nancy actually didn't have time to kill Dan in that window of time, neither did Oscar Taylor, by their own argument. Then defense switches gears and they say, well, why would Nancy drive her own van down there? It's a fair question, I suppose. But what is she supposed to drive? You rent a car locally, that's awfully suspicious. Rent a car the day before your husband is murdered, that seems awfully suspicious. So would borrowing a car. You borrow a car the day before the murder? But why did she drive her own van? As I stated yesterday, Nancy is smarter than everybody. She's done her research. She's been to the Culinary Institute, knows there's no cameras. She's probably driven that street and thinks there's no cameras. Because what are the cameras that sunk her? Interior cameras in businesses. You saw numerous. She didn't know those were there. She probably looked at that street and said, there are no cameras out here. I'm fine. Now, interestingly,
oh, that's a great point. I didn't totally realize that. Yeah, all of the video footage that they showed of her driving around in that area was from video cameras that were for security inside businesses, but they happened to catch what was going on out in the street.
defense proposes that, well, there's cameras on the BMW building, the old property room, that were obvious.
I know.
Okay. If Nancy knew those were there, does that not just bolster my argument to you that Nancy did not go all the way up to Madison Street, that she actually stayed in front of the Culinary Institute? Because if she's afraid if she goes too far up that street, she might be seen by those cameras, then she's not going to do it. So she either didn't know the cameras were there, didn't notice them, or she did know they were there, and that's why she stayed in front of the Culinary Institute, knowing she would be out of the view of the cameras. Defense then goes on to explain guns to you and why Nancy purchased the guns and what the purpose was. But I think what became painfully obvious is that defense counsel has no knowledge of firearms, as evidenced by the fact that they stated that they had no knowledge of firearms before they would question witnesses about guns. I believe Ms. Maxfield said that at least twice. I don't know anything about guns, but here I go. Because yesterday, Ms. Weinmiller stood up and gave you a completely incoherent explanation for why the slide on the gun show gun was out of battery. What do I mean by that? She stood up here and said, well, sometimes the slide is forward if there's a zip tie. Sometimes the slide is back off the gun if there's a zip tie in it. And I will tell you, that's not how it works, as you saw, and as the actual people who know things about guns testified to. If you put a zip tie through that gun and it is seated properly on the frame, that slide barrel is sticking off the back of the gun because the zip tie creates a gap and it pushes the slide off the back of the gun. But Ms. Weinmiller said, well, sometimes it's forward. No, it's not. That's not true at all. And then she explains, well, the guy at the gun show who sold it to her, Mr. Glendinning, he was manipulating it to show Nancy how to do it. Well, first of all, this guy knows how to put a slide barrel back on a frame. And he sent Nancy out with a properly seated slide barrel. But defense wants you to believe, well, maybe he messed it up somehow. Now, this is where the wires get crossed on defense. The original story given to you was that Nancy told the police that she put the gun away and never touched it. Never handled it after that because it was ugly and heavy and all that stuff. But then Nancy got up on the stand and said, no, I played with it. I messed with it. I removed the slide and barrel. I don't know if Ms. Weinmiller missed that part of the testimony, but she completely ignored it yesterday in her argument. Because if Nancy removed the slide and barrel, then she's the one that manipulated and caused that slide and barrel to be unseated or out of battery, as you heard. But Ms. Weinmiller was trying to get you to believe that it's possibly the people at the gun show, which makes no sense. They forgot the narrative, and they're telling you different stories. Speaking of different stories, you heard Ms. Weinmiller stand up in opening and say, Ms. Brophy bought that slide and barrel on eBay because she saw a pop-up ad, she just couldn't help herself, and she still needed a slide, even though she already had two, failed to explain why she needed it. And so she just went ahead and bought it. Ms. Brophy told you on the stand, I bought it intentionally. I went to eBay intentionally and purchased it. And when I said, well, wasn't it a pop-up ad of some sort? That's what your lawyer said. She turned to her lawyer and said, did you say that? They had a script that they were trying to follow, a narrative that they needed you to believe, and they messed it up over and over and over because it's all lies. It's not based in evidence. So then they go, well, we can't just not explain why Nancy remembers because that will sound ridiculous. We're going to bring in some doctors to tell you why she doesn't remember. And I'm going to address the two things that Ms. Weinmiller addressed yesterday. One, not attending. The idea here being that Ms. Brophy was just driving around, lost in her world, thinking about writing. Now, they said she was writing and jotting down notes, but she doesn't do that. She doesn't jot down notes. She sat there and told you she writes whole books in her head. But now she's jotting down notes. But there are no notes. It's a little confusing, right? So nonetheless, she's not attending because she's so busy doing this writing stuff, even though there's no evidence of that. The problem with that is that Dr. Best sat up here and told you somebody who's not attending is more likely to attend and would be expected to attend when they're doing something out of the ordinary. So yes, if Nancy drove downtown every single day, she might block out part of that drive because she's used to it, just like all of you have probably done. But she doesn't do that every day. She goes to her local drive-through Starbucks, she comes home and she writes. So partially getting dressed and driving downtown would seem a little out of the ordinary for Ms. Brophy, and she should have attended, but it doesn't matter. Because even Dr. Riesberg, their own expert, got up here and said that, well, when you don't attend, specifically he gave an example of driving, it doesn't mean you don't remember driving. You just don't recall specific parts of the driving, just like you all have experienced, I'm sure. What Dr. Riesberg did not say is that, well, when you're attending, you must just black out a certain section of time and you have no memory of what you were even doing at all. And think about your own experience when driving and doing that, sort of zoning out for a minute.
Yeah.
Do you ever look back and go, gosh, I don't even remember driving? I don't remember getting in my car. I don't remember getting home. You don't remember anything? No, because it's not real.
She's good.
So they also told you, well, okay, so she's not attending, so she's not committing things to memory, so she just blocks that out. And then she has this trauma, which prevents her from encoding these memories. But besides that, we're going to go ahead and pile on and say, must also be retrograde amnesia. Remember, these are two separate theories, but they're just kind of throwing the kitchen sink at you and hoping you bite. The problem with that is Dr. Reisberg specifically talked about Rebo's law. If you remember, he said 30 minutes before a trauma is where you would expect that sort of problem developing memories.
Yes.
30 minutes. And then you go back in 30-minute increments and you expect the memory to get better and better and better and better the farther away you get away from the trauma. That was Rebo's law. Well, when Miss Brophy's receiving the news that her husband's dead, it's almost 11 o'clock in the morning. 11 o'clock. So if she's going to have, let's give her the benefit of the doubt. Let's say 10:30. Go back a half an hour to 10. Then her memory should start getting better. 9:30, 9, 8:30, 8, 7:30, 7. Got to go back even farther, right? Because she left her house at 6:30. So you got to go all the way back to 6:30. You actually have to go before that because she had to get dressed to leave. So 6 o'clock in the morning, almost 5 hours before, Rebo's law says, no, we'd expect you to have some memory of that. But no, complete blackout. But then when faced with the idea, well, you can't have just a complete blackout because that would sound ridiculous to this jury. Well, okay, no, I do remember some stuff from that morning. Now all of a sudden she remembers that she woke up, that she talked to Dan about a leak, that he carried some towels downstairs. She partially got dressed, then blackout. None of this makes sense. If you're trying to make sense of it in your head and you go, I don't get it, I can't fathom these stories, it's because they're all designed to make you confused. Because defense is hoping that your confusion somehow equals reasonable doubt. And I can assure you, confusion is not reasonable doubt. To try to support the idea that Nancy, okay, she's downtown, they're willing to accept that now, but then she got home and she just carried on about her day. She doesn't remember this, but she used her computer apparently. Now, when they had their expert up here talking about a computer, he said, well, I saw activity about 8:48 in the morning. Looks like she's doing some insurance stuff. Then she looks like she was working on some writing. And Miss Maxfield said yesterday for quite some time, was her direct quote. Miss Brophy was on that computer manipulating a flash drive and some files for 18 minutes, not writing a book. In fact, there's no evidence she wrote a thing. The expert told you there was movement from files onto a flash drive, and it looks like one of them was opened. Can't tell if she wrote a single thing. It's a poor alibi. It's a terrible alibi, but nonetheless, Nancy Brophy's attempt at an alibi. Now, what I found interesting about that testimony is they didn't ask their own expert, well, when did the activity start that morning? Because they didn't want you to know. They wanted you to assume there was activity on that computer earlier that morning. So I asked, and he said, oh yeah, computer wasn't turned on until 8:31. Oh, no activity before that. So she's not up writing. She's not up in bed writing. She's not on her computer. 8:31, think about that timeline. She leaves downtown at 7:28. She's home by about 7:38. Give her a couple minutes for traffic. Let's call it 7:40. Her neighbors are out at 7:45 to 8 o'clock, and they see Miss Brophy pulling up frantic. So Miss Brophy drives home. She sees her neighbors, wants to make sure she's seen for her alibi, addresses them with the dog issue. No dogs in sight. She goes back home, switches out that slide barrel, and then she jumps on her computer. Defense couldn't pass on the opportunity to double down on Oscar Taylor yesterday. They want you so badly to believe Oscar Taylor's a murderer. I'm not going to rehash why you should be offended by that, but you know. The narrative is that Oscar Taylor navigated this maze of the Culinary Institute, which he's never been in before, murdered Dan. Then he apparently went over to the restaurant where the wine is kept and stole from the restaurant. Now, what I want to point out, if it's not already obvious how ridiculous that sounds, where the restaurant is. So Oscar Taylor apparently came through the storeroom, found his way this way, went back here, murdered Dan for no reason whatsoever, didn't take his money, didn't take anything else, as you've heard. Then he somehow goes either this way into here, or he comes back and goes down this way, somehow has to make it back to the kitchen where the wine is stored, assuming it's not locked up, And what does Oscar Taylor take, apparently? Takes a bottle of Cabernet, and for good measure, he's going to take a candle. That's their argument for Oscar Taylor. Ms. Weinmiller said absurd a few times yesterday. I can't think of anything more absurd than this Oscar Taylor theory. Specifically, when you think about defense's own argument about the time frame, that Oscar Taylor waited for Dan to do a few things before he went in and murdered him for no reason whatsoever.
Yeah, he's very.
And then he basically had a couple of minute window. And then he goes in. He happens to have the same exact make and caliber of gun that Nancy Brophy does. He executes Dan Brophy. Then he walks out with a bottle of cab and a candle and goes right back to canning. That's what you have to believe. And you have to believe that was all done while Nancy Brophy was there. It's ridiculous. That is not reasonable doubt. Finally, defense, once again, couldn't help themselves. They had to address Andrea Jacobs. If you recall, I didn't even bring her up in my closing argument. You don't have to believe her. The evidence is still the evidence. You don't have to believe her. But defense, just like they did when she was on the stand, went on the attack. I'm not defending Andrea Jacobs, I can assure you that. I'm a prosecutor. She committed crimes. She also pled to those crimes and is serving a prison sentence. What I want you to consider when you think about Andrea Jacobs and whether you believe her.
What an amazing point. Sorry, what an amazing point. She pled to those crimes. Unlike Nancy, who's trying to weasel her way out of murder.
Or not, is consider her motives, as you're instructed to. Consider her motives and consider the manner in which she testified.
Okay, I'm going to come in here and say, yes, the little shaman who I mentioned, her channel is fantastic. She's got dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of videos that are, anywhere between like 10 and 25 minutes, 30 minutes long. She does these really bite-sized kind of just discussions. It's just her talking. And it's a podcast that you can get her on, it's just a screen. Like, she's not there. You don't actually see her. It's just her voice. But she is just, for me, she was the perfect person to learn about narcissism from. She has a absolutely take no prisoners approach. She's extremely knowledgeable, and she does not countenance anything but like the absolute bare bones truth about these people. And about the fact that there really is no dealing with them, that the safest way to deal with a narcissist is to not deal with them at all. Having said that, she's also very understanding about how difficult it can be to get away from them. But if you're looking for any info about that, or just to feel kind of propped up a bit, if you're having a bad day or whatever, I absolutely love her and recommend her wholeheartedly to anyone and everyone.
What were Andrea Jacobs' motives to testify here? Remember, she didn't come forward. She had this conversation with Nancy over a year ago. She didn't come forward. She didn't come forward looking for a deal then. She didn't bring it up. She didn't bring it up this year either, in April, when Detective Merrill found her and went and talked to her, knowing that she had been housed with Nancy Brophy and seeing if she had anything to say. She told Detective Merrill what had happened. And then we drug her up here against her will. She told you how many times, I don't want to be here. Now, all she said was that Nancy had a slip of the tongue. They were having a discussion. Nancy, of course, being the chatter that she is, can't help herself but talk about her case. So she's talking, and they're relatively, I think, jail friends is probably the best way to put it, whatever kind of friendship that can be, but they nonetheless talk to each other. And Miss Jacobs told you, well, Nancy was explaining to me how far away the shot was. And she said it was this far away. And then she says, well, it was this far away. A slip of the tongue. That's what she told you. Is a slip of the tongue so hard to believe after you watch Nancy Brophy's testimony? I would argue that it's probably not that much of a stretch for you to say, yeah, I could see that. I must confess to you all that when we say that Andrea Jacobs didn't get anything for her testimony, that's not true. Now, did she get a benefit in her case? No. Was she hoping to get a benefit for some case that maybe she's going to be prosecuted for? She said no. We told her she wasn't getting anything for it. But she is getting something. She got 2 sheriff's deputies to come down and pick her up from Texas and give her a free plane ride to Portland, so that she could sit here and be publicly shamed and badgered by Miss Maxfield. Miss Maxfield went at her hard. You must admit. Let's talk about your crimes. Let's talk about your convictions for the world to see. This woman who wanted nothing to do with this case had to sit up there and take that. So she got that free ride. She got to be publicly shamed. And most of all, she got threats to her safety and her well-being. That's what she got in exchange for her testimony. You should consider that when you consider whether you believe her or not. And consider the fact that defense counsel was so afraid of her testimony, so afraid of it, that not only did they badger her on the stand, then they brought in several people to call her a liar. They brought in 2 doctors, just as many doctors as they had to testify about Nancy Brophy's memory and her what kind of person she is. They brought in just as many doctors to call Ms. Jacobs a liar. That's how scared they were that you would believe Ms. Jacobs. I'm wrapping this up, I promise. I do want you to remember that reasonable doubt is actually based on common sense and reason. Right? It's not beyond all doubt, as you've heard, although I think defense counsel's characterization would like you to lean that way, but that is not the law. We've given you the puzzle pieces to put together the picture. There might be a puzzle piece missing that you might want to know about. But when you take a step back from that puzzle and you look at it and there's a puzzle piece missing, you can still see the picture. You know what is there. Most of the excuses and reasons that you heard from the defense counsel throughout this case and during closing arguments came from Nancy herself. Self-serving statements developed over the course of almost 4 years. The other places that information came from was from defense experts, like about the retirement plan, the only people you heard about it from. Or they came from those supplemental statements from the lawyers themselves, or from their questions. None of those are evidence. Ms. Weinmiller told you that the last time Nancy saw Dan was that morning when they talked about the leak. The reality is the last time Nancy saw Dan was when she stood over him and looked him in his eyes as he's breathing in his last bit of life. Paralyzed, injured, but he wasn't dead yet. So she looked into his eyes and pulled that trigger one last time. That's the last time she saw him. That sparkle in Nancy's eye that defense counsel gave you several adjectives for, that sparkle was not Nancy having fond memories of Dan. You saw a sparkle in her eyes. It was the crocodile tears conjured up to get your sympathy. Just as Nancy told you on the stand, anyone is capable of murder. Anyone. That would include Nancy Brophy. And during her last rambling rant on cross-examination, she blurted out this sentence: "How do you defend against the truth?" Whoops. You can't. Can't defend against the truth. Nancy is guilty of murdering her husband, and it is now up to you to deliver the justice for Chef Dan Brophy and the rest of the Brophy family. I am asking you to return a verdict of guilty. Thank you.
Right? He's so amazing. He's so amazing. I never saw a single tear, no. I think that he just was probably being a decent person and not saying it was Duper's delight, honestly. But yeah, again, Jem and anybody else who was struggling with NPD or stuck in a relationship, not struggling with it yourself or whatever, but even if you are, but you know what I mean? If you're struggling with a narcissist in your life, the little shaman is awesome. And she's like, and Jem, you're saying that you're struggling with, like, you're so reactive. That's very normal. It's very, very normal. After years and years of abuse, it's very normal to be reactive. So, just saying, cut yourself slack whenever humanly possible. So do people want to watch the verdict? Or because I don't think I'm going to do another video of Nancy Brophy because there's not that much. Here it is. Yeah, it's like 5 minutes long. So let's watch this one. Hang on. Yeah, so here we go. This is just a hang on. Here we go. Hang on. Sorry, being a spaz. I'll just start.
We want to bring you that breaking news, that verdict in the Nancy Crampton Brophy murder trial. Let's listen in.
Yeah.
Also with Ms. Brophy. My last name is spelled Maxfield, and my bar number is 844-337.
All right, so in a moment, we are going to bring in the jury and take the verdict. I would just caution everyone assembled, regardless of what the verdict is, there are to be no verbal outbursts in court. But with that, we will bring the jury in as soon as we can. Sure.
Okay, we'll go off record and meet for 1 minute.
Oh my God, the most uninspired cameraman. What is going on? It's a 4-minute video and it's.
And again, they are bringing in the jury in.
It looks like the verdict is in the hand of juror 46, so we'll collect that.
I really hope we get to see her reaction. The cameraman has not been inspired so far.
All right, if we can have Mrs. Brophy rise. Says, we, the jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled cause, do find our verdicts upon the counts submitted to us as follows. Count 1, murder in the second degree, guilty. And then with regards to the 2 questions, the state alleging that during the commission of this felony, the defendant caused or threatened the use of a firearm, the answer is yes. And then the state further alleges that during the commission of this felony, the defendant and the victim were married. The answer is yes. Now, I will ask juror number 46, it indicates your number in the signature block, and that is you who put your number there. All right, and then by a show of hands, I'm going to ask everyone first whether the verdict of guilty is their verdict on count 1. Raise your hand if it is. All right, and then with regard to the question of caused or threatened the use of a firearm, if your answer is yes, raise your hand. And then lastly, if during the commission of the felony, the defendant and victim were married and your answer is yes, raise your hand. All right. Does either side have anything for the record?
No, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor.
All right. The jury will be excused. We thank you for your time.
We'll go off record. All rise.
All right. Well, as you just heard, that jury of 12 people.
Yeah, so there we go. There is a video of the sentencing. Do people want to watch the sentencing? It's about 20 minutes long. Sorry, I'm spazzing out over here. I need to share the screen. I'm going to do the sentencing because it's only 20 minutes. And I don't want to do a whole other video just for that. So, we might as well, right? We're here now. Let's just do it. Okay. So, let me go.
18 CR 59251. Appearing on behalf of the state of Oregon, Sean Overstreet, OVERSTREET, bar number 114859. Ms. Brophy is present, currently in custody, represented by counsel. Today is the date and time set for sentencing, and the state is ready to proceed.
Herman?
Good morning, Your Honor. Nicole Herman, HERMANN, bar number 126353.
Loeb.
Good morning, Your Honor. Madeline Loeb, spelled Loeb, bar number 173970.
Weinmiller?
Morning, Your Honor. Chris Weinmiller with Ms. Brophy. Weinmiller is WINEMILLER, and my bar number is 863177.
Yeah.
Ms. Baxter?
Good morning. Lisa Maxfield also here with Ms. Brophy. My bar number is 844337, and my last name is spelled MAXFIELD.
All right, Mr. Overstreet, we'll turn to the state. Were there any people who wanted to make statements this morning?
There are, Your Honor, and I think I have an order here that we can proceed with. The first would be Daniel Brophy's mother, Karen Brophy. She provided a written statement to have me read to the court.
Okay.
It's been a long 3.5 years for Jack and me. They've been They've been a time of reflecting on the loss our family has suffered. What we heard on that September day, we could not believe. Nancy arrested? You were part of our family for over 25 years. Was that relationship all deception? My heart breaks if this is true. We will never understand how you could decide that it was an advantage for you to take the life of our son, that he did not deserve to live. So you took his life from all of us, a pawn in your plan? You will never know our beautiful great-grandchildren, Dan's grandchildren. These children deserve to know and love him as we all have. It has been heartwarming for us to hear from many what an amazing, wonderful man our son was. We always knew that, now the world does. I don't know what the rest of your life will be like. Not pleasant, I am sure, but we hope you will find God's grace ahead of you. Karen and Jeff. And Your Honor, with that, I believe the next person to speak would be Clorinda Perez.
All right.
And Your Honor, unless you have a preference, I've offered both either to stand at the podium or if the person would be more comfortable to sit in the witness stand. I don't know if you...
Whatever the people want to do. In fact, if they even want to speak from back in the rows, that is fine too. But Ms. Perez, I see you want to be here. Okay, I should explain though that your statements will be to me, just so you understand. But you can sit there if you prefer.
I'll stand right here.
Okay.
Today, Your Honor, I stand for Chef Brophy, for the students and the instructors of OCI, whose lives were changed forever that Saturday morning that Chef Brophy's life was taken. Your Honor, his eyes were green.
I just want to say for anybody who doesn't know, this is the student of Dan's that found him and performed CPR to try to save him. She thought he'd had a heart attack.
His eyes told it all. His eyes were green and they were utterly heartbroken. Utterly heartbroken because he knew because he's seen who did this. And I will forever have to live with those green heartbroken eyes. Nancy Brophy did not care what she had to do, who she had to hurt, or who she had to destroy, so long as her evil plan succeeded. And only a heartless, calculated person could be capable of doing this. She did not once think of who was going to enter into that kitchen, who was going to find him, and who was going to be there that day. The student that called 911 and so bravely relayed the operator's information to me, my dear friend who courageously cleared out the kitchen so no one would have to see Chef Brophy the way that she left him. Chef Sadie, who knelt next to me on the floor and begged the Lord with tears streaming down her eyes, begging for Chef Brophy's life. All of us were affected that day. And to hear her say that we went on with our lives and nothing happened, that we weren't affected, is a true statement and a reflection of what a cold-blooded murderer she is. Chef Brophy will continue to live on. He will continue to live on in all the hearts of those that knew and loved him, and his memory will never die. Your Honor, I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Your Honor, we have a couple of family members joining us on WebEx. I would like to ask if Bill Brophy or Rob Brophy would like to make any comments.
All right, hold on for just a minute. You're currently muted in the courtroom, so wait for just one moment.
Okay, we'll start with Bill Brophy. If he would like to make a statement, we can put him up on the screen as well.
All right, Mr. Bill Brophy, did you wish to make a statement?
Oh, 1 second, sorry, Judge. There we go.
I need a minute to pull up my screen.
Okay.
Are you unmuted?
Yes, we can hear him. We can hear Mr. Bill Brophy.
You unmuted, babe.
Often in the morning, I ponder the fact that I will never see my brother on this earth again. I will never get an opportunity to go mushroom hunting with him. There will be no more yeasted waffles at family gatherings. Because of your most selfish act, we have all experienced a great loss. Even if you are not willing to admit to all of us what you did, I hope you can confess to your maker. Whatever time you spend in prison is nothing compared to an eternity in hell. Thank you.
Nice
I'm
one.
going to go ahead and mute Bill Brophy. Who is the next person, Mr.
I'll
Obi?
just check with.
Sorry, that was awesome. I'm guessing from the tone and tenor of his voice that he is perhaps not accustomed to expressing his feelings, but I think he did. I think he did his brother proud there. So this is why the victim impact statements are so important, because you get to hear who these people are that have been victimized by the horrible narcissist, usually.
Rob Brophy to see if he would like to make a statement.
Rob Brophy. Okay, give me.
Oh, nice. Oh, hi, Gary Reed.
Okay, I have Rob Brophy unmuted, Judge.
And Mr. Rob Brophy, you don't have to make a statement. You can if you wish. Did you wish to say anything?
Your Honor, I appreciate the opportunity, but I'm just going to pass. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
And Your Honor, I just want to ask if there's anybody on the WebEx, family members that were on WebEx that we did not give an opportunity to.
Okay, give me just a second. We have it set so they cannot unmute themselves, so I will change that. Okay, so if there's anybody on WebEx that is associated with the Brophy family, they can now unmute themselves. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody unmute themselves at this time, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off that ability.
All right, thank you. Then at this time, Your Honor, ask Nathaniel Stillwater if you'd like to make a statement.
Okay.
This is Dan's son, yeah? From his first marriage?
The years of deceit have spanned decades. From learning that your solution to my father being married to my mother was, I can fix that, to years of payroll and tax fraud that you waged on your employees. You've always thought you were one step ahead. Your largest financial contribution in the latter years was sending my father off to work an extra job so you could continue to pretend to be an author. My father possessed more knowledge, depth, accomplishments, recognition, and joy in life than a person as shallow and self-serving as yourself are capable of. Instead of rising to the occasion, facing life's challenges head on, and contributing in a meaningful way, you opted to lie, steal, cheat, defraud, and ultimately kill the man that was, for some reason still unbeknownst to me, your biggest fan. You executed my father in an act of cold-blooded, premeditated murder. The man that did everything for you. Cooked your meals, washed your clothes, accepted your sedentary nature, supported your failed endeavors, and brought you into the warm embrace of our family. Your repayment for decades of dedication, trust, and love? To plot his murder on Christmas Eve, while in the presence of his parents and grandchildren. Pain you have delivered to us is immeasurable. Your theft of a parent and grandfather for such selfish reasons is unforgivable. You were, to borrow from your catalog, the wrong wife.
Oh.
Lying at the bottom of a river or buried in the earth somewhere was the instrument you used to destroy lives. Not only the life of the man that loved you unconditionally, but those of my grandparents that offered you acceptance and support, of my wife that took solace in knowing there was family on this side of the country to help support our growing family. Of my eldest daughter, who was beguiled by your feigned displays of nurturing. of the son my wife was 5 months pregnant with on the day he was murdered, who would have surely been my father's greatest admirer, and our youngest child, who will never even know your name. You are a monster, and I am ashamed that I have to admit to my children that people like you walk amongst us, undetected, until the moment best serves to let narcissistic personality traits devolve into those of a full-blown sociopath. Unburdened by morality, empathy, compassion, and decency, you chose to extinguish the life of someone capable of giving all of those things to the many people that surrounded him. You lived in the shadow of a great human being. Instead of acknowledging your shortcomings and redirecting your delusions of grandeur, you chose to deprive this world of a teacher, a father, a grandparent, and someone who served as an inspiration to the countless lives he touched. I would suggest you be ashamed of your actions, but that would presuppose you possess the ability to think of anyone besides yourself. In the words of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, there's no greater misfortune than dying alone. Yet for you, Nancy, I can't imagine a more fitting end to this tragedy. Thank you, Your Honor.
That might have been literally the most perfect thing I've ever seen. From the baritone of his voice, to the gravitas of his delivery, to the clear love and admiration he felt for his father, to the absolute contempt and vitriol that he feels towards the woman who so richly deserves it. What a absolutely beautiful piece of oration that was. I am delighted that I got to share that with all of you. Amazing. Wow. There you go, right? There, right there, is the cost of Nancy and her ilk. What a beautiful moment. I don't think there's any way to follow that up. So we'll just carry on and know that everything that comes after will be less than what that was. My God. What an amazing young man. His father would have been, was, I'm sure, and would continue to be deeply proud.
Your Honor, I believe that's everybody who wished to make a statement today. We do have the issue still of restitution. We are requesting that restitution be set over for 90 days, but that we actually set a date for that hearing to happen. And we're requesting 2 hours for that hearing. I think we're trying to work out a date that works best, but of course we need to check with the court to see what works for the court within 90 days as well.
Sure. I would say a Friday is probably going to be the best day. All right. So no one else then to speak for the state?
I don't believe so, Your Honor.
Defense?
Your Honor, the defense has nothing to add.
All right. Well, I do want to say to the family and friends of Chef Brophy, as he came to be described during this trial, I can't imagine what it's like to go through years of waiting to find resolution in this case. Although I never knew him, I did learn a lot about him through the various witnesses that testify. And I know that Karen Brophy said it was heartwarming to hear from them, because I think the thing that you can take away, which I hope gives you some small measure of solace, is that he was a mentor and a teacher to many and had an impact over a lot of people's lives. And hopefully they will turn and have an impact on others themselves as they teach. The impression I came away with was that he was a man of quiet dignity. And so I hope that this at least will bring some level of closure to you. Mrs. Brophy, if you can rise for sentencing.
Oh, thank you.
In Oregon, for the crime of murder in the second degree. The sentence is a life sentence. I'll order that you be considered for parole after 25 years. And we'll leave open restitution for 90 days. I will let you figure out, I know you want to pick a date right now, so we'll figure that out. I will waive other fines and fees given the lengthy prison time. You can have a seat and we'll figure out the, yes, Mr. Overstreet.
Sorry, Your Honor, I did cut you off. There's still the issue of the gun minimum. This was charged with firearm language attached, and the jury did find that a firearm was used in this crime. And so we'd ask that the judgment reflect ORS 161610, which is the 5-year mandatory gun minimum for use of a firearm. We just ask that that be reflected on the judgment. That clearly runs the first 5 years of the sentence, so it doesn't add anything or change anything.
Sure, and it'll reflect that in this being a murder case, the state will create the judgment for my signature, which of course defense will get a chance to look at as well. As far as 90 days, I've just mentioned that a Friday would be the best day. We'll give you some options in just a moment here.
So I guess she's not going to speak.
I'm gone the last 2 weeks.
Yes, it's going to be in the beginning of September, so give me just a second. I'm just having trouble with Odyssey.
Sorry, I don't know what's going to happen here, so I'm just...
Could do Friday, September 9th at 9 a.m.
Does that work for the state?
We can make it work.
It looks like it may not work for someone.
Aaron, also on behalf of the victim, I will be in Washington, D.C., and I expect that if this restitution hearing is necessary, I will be assembling the information needed and process.
Okay, what about the week prior to that? What would that date be?
The week, August, you are not, can't do September 2nd, so would September 16th, which would be the week following.
Your Honor, I'm in trial that week. That won't work for the defense.
All right. Can we do it on another day of the week?
We can try. Give me just a second. Let me take a look. We could do... Sorry, it's just frozen.
Sure.
We could do the 6th, which would be a Tuesday.
Oh, shoot.
Sorry, so there's just a couple more minutes of this. I'm pretty sure we're not going to hear anything from Nancy, but I don't want to miss it in case she says something. I don't think so, but...
That entire week? Okay, I think I just misunderstood when that started. Okay. And defense is in a trial.
Yes, am I around?
We are not available. The trials.
But not necessarily here. Does it work for at least one of the state's members?
We'll make it work.
All right.
Okay, well, not with a bang, with a whimper. Fine with me. She can just go off into... Oh, God. Again, with the losing of the words. Anonymity. She can go off into anonymity now forever. So, yeah, that was amazing. I was completely and utterly blown away by Nathaniel's statement. I mean, the victim impact statements are often really powerful, but just the delivery, my God, the voice, just everything. Like, you just got the real sense of what a solid human being he was, which then gave you the sense of what a solid human being Dan was, and what a huge loss that patriarch is, right? To his family, to his son and his grandchildren and his, his great grandchildren, and the legacy. And she just snatched it all away from all of them just for stuff, right? out of entitlement, jealousy, resentment. The way that that Nathaniel characterized her, I thought was just so spot on, right? The way he just called her out as just lazy, worthless, good for basically lazy, worthless, and good for nothing. Oh, hang on a sec. Hang on. Sorry. Like a complete idiot here. Sorry, it's my landlady. Hang on, I'll be right back. Sorry. That just keeps happening lately. My landlady keeps knocking on the door when I'm in the middle of doing these lives lately. Anyway, it's time for me to go. It's almost 4 hours. This is my longest live. Well, no, that's not true. I did some of the trials, but it feels long and I'm tired and I need to eat. And now I need to go find out what my landlady wanted. And yes, thank you all so much for being here and sharing that last bit with me. I'm glad that we carried on through to hear the witness statements. So yeah, I need to get some dinner. I'm starving. So thank you all for coming along with me on this fun ride with Nancy Brophy and her well, it's 25 to life, right? So I mean, she ain't gonna live another 25 years anyway, so either way. Yeah, so thanks everybody. Boss Lady's gone off. It's her birthday, but happy birthday to you, Boss Lady, and thank you again for all your help, and thank you all for being here once again. Gonna love you and leave you until next time.